Meet Diaz, a grown man decked out in massive armor and carrying a super heavy weapon. He thought this invisible world was his new private kingdom, but it was actually just a never-ending field of grass. Back in the day, our hero's mom told him he had to grow up and protect the people he loves most. Those were actually her very last words to him. His dad also. He promised to honor his late parents by following their wishes, so he set out on his own with a fire in his heart. But right as he turned 15, a massive war with the neighboring countries kicked. He joined the fight to honor his parents and keep everyone safe. The war dragged on for 20 massive years. Right in the middle of all that chaos, he turned 35. Finally, they signed a peace treaty with the enemy and called off the war so everyone could finally catch their breath. They even called this guy a hero at one point, mostly because he was a total beast in the war and his records were way better than anyone else's. The king hyped him up for all those wins and finally gave him what he deserved, naming him a lord and handing over his very own land to rule. This guy couldn't even read and was only good for fighting. He had no clue why he was the one getting all this special treatment. Finally, he found out his real job was, first things first, Diaz had to check out his new territory, so he tossed his gear into a cart and started the journey, even though he wasn't exactly thrilled about it. He had to rush out of the capital with zero time to pack, all while that official watched him like a hawk the entire time. A voice rings out and the cart jerks to a stop, making Diaz realize they've finally reached his land. The guy broke free from his leashes thinking they'd finally reached the center and stopped, but as the official started showing off the territory's borders, Diaz was totally blown away. All he sees is a giant field of grass stretching on forever, so his whole domain is basically just wide open space. The official tells him this is the perfect spot to finally get to work, so the guy looks at the papers and sees the plane is called Neutros and his name is Diaz. Starting today, he's officially Diaz Neutros, and a little while later, he heads down to a stream to grab a drink. Diaz gulps down some water and catches his breath, thankful for a clean drink after surviving on muddy filth during the war, but even after walking for miles, he still hasn't spotted. He decides to give the herb a taste test to see if it's any good, but big surprise, it's totally gross. He flops onto the grass and decides to figure it all out tomorrow, because he seriously needs a plan to stay alive. He's sticking around for 2 more days to help someone out. Then he's dipping from this world to finally make his parents' dreams come true. Out of nowhere, a stranger walks up and asks who he is, then gives the sleeping Diaz a hard kick to wake him up. Diaz snaps awake and sees a girl right in his face with a long horn growing from her forehead. Diaz was totally stunned to see a human, but he was super confused about Racy until he noticed the horn on her head, and she just kept demanding to know what he was doing there. The guy wakes up and says his name is Diaz, and when the girl realizes he's been crashing there, she asks him why on earth he's sleeping in a place like this. Diaz told her he had nowhere else to crash, and when the girl asked why he even came to this world, he just said he was told to live here. She asked if he was seriously that stupid, and Diaz just admitted he couldn't really argue with her because this place was his home now. She asks him what he's really after, and Diaz just tells her his only goal is to stay alive. She starts pulling out her bow, but the guy suddenly shouts for her to just wait and stop. She told him he'd only survive if he started being honest, but Diaz insisted he was already telling the truth. If that's not enough for her, he's also determined to honor his parents' final wishes and spend his life protecting anyone who can't fight back. She calls him out for lying, but Diaz just says he has no reason to trick her, making her scream as she demands to know if he's a friend or an enemy. Diaz had no clue what she wanted, or if she even wanted the truth, so he tried to stay neutral, but she told him he had to pick a side. Diaz jumps to his feet and shouts that he's officially her friend and protector, promising to keep her safe no matter who tries to stop him. Suddenly, the girl's horn starts glowing like crazy, catching Diaz totally off guard while she just stares at the blue flames in total confusion. Just like that, the blue fire vanished. The girl freaked out, saying it had to be a mistake and there was no way this was happening. She grabbed Diaz's hand and bolted. The girl tells him to just follow her back to her village, and Diaz is totally shocked that a village even exists on this plane. Diaz and the girl finally made it to the village. Everyone there was totally shocked to see them. The locals kept a super close eye on the 2 newcomers. And that's a wrap for this video. Finally, the crew reaches the chieftain's place, and the leader immediately notices Aruna's new friend is the same guy who set off that massive blue light. She agreed and said she found him napping, but when she tried to grill him, he just kept asking dumb questions until she finally demanded to know if he was a friend or a foe. And that's when a mysterious blue light suddenly flashed. The chief was totally shocked and asked if the light was pure blue with 0 red in it. And after she confirmed it, he asked if the guy even knew the secret meaning behind his own name. The guy introduces himself as Diaz, And the chief admits that name carries some serious weight in the shadows, then points out that Diaz claimed to be Aruna's friend and asks if he's actually... So now Diaz knows her name is Aruna, and he tells everyone that since they're on his turf, they're all basically going to be his friends one way or another. The chief asks why he's so sure, and Diaz just says it's his job. So when the chief asks who gave him the green light, Diaz reveals it was the king. Aruna snaps an arrow onto her bow and points it right at Diaz, who totally panics and puts his hands in the air. The chief told everyone to chill out and stop being so impatient. Then he looked at Diaz and demanded the whole story from the start, especially how he even ended up getting an order like that. Diaz wasn't 100% sure what he meant by beginning to end, but he still spilled his whole life story starting all the way back from when he was just a little kid. The chief finally figured out why the guy was glowing blue, and he was shocked to find someone this powerful who wasn't a horn owner, so he turned to Diaz and called him a feudal. He's ready to go all out to protect his people, but he wants to hear the guy's side of the story first and asks what they'll do if they just didn't recognize. Diaz wonders what would have happened if the villagers never joined him, and after he says nothing would change, the chief tells him they'd still be best friends even if he wasn't there. The guy agrees and says they're basically neighbors on this plane, so Diaz flashes a smile and says that since neighbors look out for each other, they're pretty much friends now. The chief is locked in, hanging on every single word Diaz says. Diaz is totally confused about why this guy is grilling him with so many questions. I mean, if these people aren't his followers, then who the heck are they? Diaz suddenly gets a weird feeling these villagers aren't actually his people, but he tells himself that's impossible since this is his land and everything on it belongs to him. The chief asked if Diaz finally got the picture, since he was totally right that those guys weren't his subjects. He keeps it real and tells them they're King Diaz's enemies who've been fighting a massive war against his kingdom for ages. They might be his king's enemies, but to him, they're just his friends now. He says Diaz is a blue, the rarest kind there is, which means he can finally live in peace with everyone. Then, he tells Diaz to look up and asks if he's ready to hear his story. Meet Mo-Ru, the leader of the Oni tribe, who's been locked in a massive war with the country of Diaz for ages to see who really rules these lands. They spent 50 years fighting non-stop until they finally lost and got kicked right off the plains with massive losses. Diaz remembered the chief saying they were kicked out of the plains 50 years ago, but he was seriously wondering how they were still surviving there. The chief points to his horn and explains they store magic inside them, giving them crazy powers that normal people could never dream. They've got this insane fog magic that can hide people, houses, and even their own presence, so they used it to sneak back to the plains and stay totally hidden from the kings. Diaz is totally caught off guard by this, but he's not sure if he should spill the secret since he's supposed to be loyal to the king. The chief says he only shares his secrets with Diaz because he's blue, and he'd never tell anyone else that. There's this crazy magic called the Judgment of Souls, and if Diaz has even a tiny bit of hate in him, his soul is going to glow bright red. He laughs and asks Diaz if he really thinks it's normal to still be following his parents' dying wishes. He's lived a long life, but he's never seen anyone. The chieftains were hyped that the local lord was a total moron, but they knew they couldn't stay hidden in the shadows forever. Diaz asks why they're even sticking around when they could just run away to some far-off place and finally live in peace. The chief says they can't just pack up and leave because their whole survival depends on these Memu cattle that only live on these plains. This guy is going to protect his people and become an epic lord because if he fails, nobody has any idea who's taking over next. Diaz asks about the guy who came before him, and the chief admits he was around, but he lived in a totally different spot and was just a fool with some really bad hobbies. But it turns out he just passed away from a sickness. He tells Diaz that he's got no place to stay and zero gear. The villagers are down to help him and even share their animals. He bragged that Diaz keeping quiet made him safe and that he could use Aruna now, while the girl just stared him down. Out of nowhere, the girl spins around and shouts at the chief, demanding to know what he means. But he just tells her she needs to learn how to survive the wild plains and that she's going to be living with a man. The chieftain says Aruna brought this stranger to them, so now she's the one who has to deal with the mess. Diaz realized his journey as a lord was finally starting, and his first big move was moving in with a girl named Aruna. Meet the Mimeo, a two-horned cow that's basically a giant ball of wool, and people raise them strictly for their fluff instead of meat. The more grass these Mimo gobble up, the faster their fur grows, so they shave it off to trade for food and gear. And Diaz asks if that's really the deal. Aruna screamed at the guy, asking if he was mocking her or if he just didn't get it. But Dia yelled back that he totally understood everything. Between farming and hunting in Memu, Diaz has a ton of info to juggle, And even though Aruna is probably stuck here against her will, she's still working hard to teach him every survival trick she knows. Chief Moru kept his word and handed Maimu over. So to pay back the Oni for their trust, he decided his first big move as Lord was to start growing their population. He turns to Aruna and asks for tips on how to grow the population. But she gets super mad and snaps back, asking if he has anything else to say. Nobody actually knows how many people live there since they don't keep track. And Aruna tells the guy to stop yapping because they have way bigger problems, like their supplies running low. She warns him that having a huge crowd means nothing if they're all just going to starve or get sick and die. And she demands to know if he actually gets that. Diaz said he'd need more backup once they got more recruits, but Aruna screamed at him to not even think about it. Diaz said he totally got it, apologized to the girl, and told her to just forget he even brought it up since he really needed to figure out their housing and supply situation. She rips the bag off and tosses it to Diaz, and he's like, "Wait, what is this?" She explains it's Matabi Earth, a special grass that wild animals are obsessed with, and the second you throw it down, they'll all come charging your way. She explains that hunting isn't just about the meat, because those skins and horns can be traded at the village for supplies or even a brand new yurt. Hunting like this is the perfect way to build up his land, and since Diaz says he's a total natural, he can just turn off his brain and go wild. Aruna told the guy to keep the wind at his back and just keep walking until he spotted a village. She warned him that if he used his power too close to the town, the local animals would. He pulls out a pouch and wonders how much he's actually supposed to use. He totally forgot if Aaron gave him a specific amount or not. But he's not going to wait around, so he just decides to go for it. He tosses the entire pouch and just lets it rip. The bag rips open and seeds go flying everywhere. The guy lets out a sigh, knowing the trap is finally set. Now, he's just playing the waiting game for the animals to. He's guessing there's maybe 10 animals, but for 10 yurts, he needs 100, and that's definitely going to take way longer than a day. Diaz whips around to see a massive swarm of animals charging straight for him, and he's totally shocked by how many there are. He has no clue how these animals got on the plane, but if he catches them all, he can reach his goal in one shot. Diaz gets ready for the fight, planning to just swing his axe with all his strength and trust his gut. And even though it's a pretty bad strategy, he's feeling totally confident. Since he was a total rookie, he had to learn the sword and bow while aiming for tiny gaps in armor. But it all felt way too confusing, and he just couldn't get the. Predicting the enemy's moves and finding the perfect opening was a total struggle. But he wasn't about to call himself an idiot for it. Right then, that battle axe was a total beast. He didn't even need a strategy anymore. If the enemy had a shield, he just smashed right through it. If they had armor, it didn't matter what they had because they all ended up dead the same way. And then the animals just looked at each other and bolted. Diaz saw them making a run for it and thought about taking out half the squad since their moves were just way too easy to read. He looks around the field and realizes he totally wrecked the place. There are just way too many animals lying everywhere. He has absolutely no clue how he's going to move them all. He could have just carried them one by one, but he totally blanks and starts swinging his axe like a dummy, which is definitely going to get Aruno called a fail lord again, especially since, a bit later, Diaz finally makes it back, and Aruna meets him to say he did an awesome job since taking down a black buffalo on his very first hunt is a total boss move. Diaz looked at her confused and asked if that was really a black buffalo, explaining that he took out half the herd, but the rest were just too fast to catch. The girl's jaw drops as she asks how many he actually took down, and he just casually tells her it was probably 30 or 40. Arunas was literally screaming about how insane and awesome it all was, and the girl realized she was seeing this guy in a whole new way. The chief said the guy did an amazing job without even bragging, and Aruna totally agreed, saying she'd never seen anyone with that much guts. Aruna sprints off to warn the others, saying they're going to move all of Diaz's black buffalo and bring him with them. While Diaz was busy at the grill, the chief totally hyped him up, saying that hunting 30 black buffalo at once was the ultimate show of strength. Diaz paused for a second and asked the chief what he meant by being a real man, since it was clear his idea was totally different from everyone else's. The chief says being a man is all about your worth. It's about grinding hard, being someone people can actually trust, and always finding a way to make things happen. All those traits add up to pure masculinity, and the moment Diaz asked if he actually had it, Aaron finally started treating him with way more respect. The chief tells him Aruno is the hottest girl in the village, and she'd definitely be into what he's packing. But Diaz needs to know the truth. Is he really gonna, The chief asks Diaz what kind of answer he's looking for and tells him girls only care about how manly a guy is. But when Diaz asks if being handsome or a smooth talker matters, the chief just tells him to stop talking crazy. If you marry a guy who isn't tough, You and your kids are going to starve. Because for the women in this tribe, being a real man is the only thing that matters. Diaz finally realized that these people see the world in a totally different way. The chief then told him that if he wants to marry Aruna, he's got to pay a bride price. The chief said Aruna was super pretty and a hard worker, so she wasn't going to be cheap. But after all the animals the guy hunted that day, he figured it was a fair trade to marry her. Diaz asked if he could actually marry Aruna. The chief told him there were some rules they had to follow first. Diaz thought this meant everything was good to go. But the way they looked at, he knows he can't mess around right now, so he's focusing on finding a home base and grabbing all the supplies he can carry. The chief told him not to sweat it because his people are compatible with everyone and can totally have kids with other races. Diaz was totally knocked out at home, but as soon as he rolled out of bed, he spotted Aruna waiting there to say good morning and tell him she'd already made breakfast. Diaz sits down and digs in, telling her the food looks fire, which makes the girl get all shy and ask if he's serious, but he promises her it's actually delicious. Aruna asks Diaz when he's heading out to hunt, but Diaz thinks they're already stocked up and asks if they actually need anything else. Aruna says that with more people, they'll need a well, a storehouse, and water pumps, so they'll have to hire a village expert, but they're going to need way more stuff to trade for his help. The guy says he's going to hunt black buffalo, but Aruna tells him it's a bad move since the village doesn't even need them. Then she asks Diaz if he's ever actually hunted a monster before. She asks if they should go hunt monsters, and Diaz realizes those beasts are lurking in every dark corner of the planet. They sneak out of the black miasma and creepy ruins, going totally berserk and attacking everyone because they hate anything that breathes, leaving nothing but a trail of destruction behind. Their meat and blood are straight up poison, but their skin, horns, and that demon core near their heart are actually super useful for everyday life. Diaz asks if any monsters are lurking nearby, and Aruna tells him they're rare but definitely out there, promising to use her magic to track them if he lets her join him. Diaz told her hunting wasn't some easy walk through the village, and it was actually super dangerous, so he just wanted her to point him in the right direction. Aruna claimed that with Diaz by her side, it'd be as easy as a stroll through the village, so he finally gave in and let her tag along. Diaz steps outside and gets a good stretch in. Then he checks on the Mamu chilling in their pen. These are the ones Chief Muru gave him. The male is named Francois, and he headed to a nearby stream to wash up and shave, but then he spotted villagers trading a bunch of supplies for buffalo. Diaz is freaking out because he's only half-shaved and looks like a total mess, but then Aruna suddenly calls out that she's finally ready. Suddenly, the whole village was totally shocked, and when Diaz looked at Aruna, he realized she looked like a completely different person because her makeup was totally different than usual. He finally realized why she'd changed, and right then, Aruna rushed over to DS to tell him the boys were watching Mimu. She told him that was exactly why they could hang out all day long. Diaz felt all the other guys staring him down like they wanted to kill him. He knew they had to get moving, and the northern plains are a total danger zone where monsters just randomly spawn in. DS figures that after taking down just one or two monsters, they'll have all the loot they need to build a well and a warehouse. Aruna tells everyone to let her handle the monster hunting with her magic since she's a total pro at both chores and spells, and Diaz gives her the green light to start. Aruna flashed a grin, balled up her fists, and started chanting as a glowing dome popped up around her, but she didn't stop for a second. The girl snapped her eyes open and said she found a monster, and since it was massive and all alone, it was definitely the one to blame. Diaz wondered if this guy was actually a threat, so she told Aruna to go hide while she went to check him out herself. Aruna said they're sticking together since she's got camouflage magic, and if the monster is too strong, they can just use mist magic to bail. DS realized this girl just wouldn't quit, but he was totally chill since Aruna was finally safe. They start heading up a mountain of rocks, but suddenly Aruna freaks out and stares right at the monster. Diaz asks if that thing is just a turtle, but Aruna reveals it's actually an earth dragon, and they have no clue why this monster is even here. Diaz is hyped to fight whoever shows up and tells Aruna to hide, while Aruna begs the girl not to be reckless because there's no way a human can beat an earth dragon. Diaz says they can just run if things get scary, but what are they going to do if he starts chasing them down? Out of nowhere, the earth dragon spots him, but Diaz isn't about to let that happen. He knows if he goes for the neck or legs, the beast will just hide like a turtle. Diaz figures he's just got to go for it, but when he swings at the shell, his axe actually cracks, and he realizes this thing is way tougher than it looks. He goes for the neck, but the turtle dodges, so Diaz keeps throwing huge swings while Aruna watches every move. Diaz leaps to the side and stares at the coiled beast, realizing it's using its shell to plug the hole, a move he totally didn't think a dragon could pull off. Aruna is totally panicking and tells Diaz to run because soloing an earth dragon is impossible, but he's not leaving until he gives it everything he's got. He knows Aruna is going to call him a total idiot again, but he's got no other choice. So if the first hit doesn't work, he's just going to swing a second time. If that fails, you got to land 3 solid hits because that's just how he rolls. And he'll keep spamming that move until he's totally wiped out. The guy slams his axe into the monster, but the blade actually starts to crack. Aruna is totally shocked, and DS realizes he almost snapped the whole thing. DS grabs the hammer and pops his repair skill to fix it in a flash. And while Aruna is completely shocked, DS totally expected that since he was just as blown away the first time he did it. He scored this battle axe back when he was just a rookie, taking it as a trophy after totally wrecking an enemy soldier. He kept the axe because it looked sick and was super tough, plus it could even fix its own scratches. The healing kicks in automatically, but he can force it to happen again with his mind, and Diaz says it's all good but they need a second round. Time is ticking and Diaz is sweating buckets because he just can't crack that shell no matter what he tries. And once it gets dark, they'll have to give up and head home. Diaz looks over at Aruna and realizes something is totally off, like she's freezing. So he starts thinking he should probably just stop. Diaz keeps smashing the shell until cracks start spreading everywhere, and Aruna is totally shocked that he actually broke through. The turtle realized its shell was cracked, so it popped a skill and slammed into DS, leaving Aruna totally freaking out for his life. Diaz finally smashes the turtle right in the legs and realizes he can actually fight back. But even though the guy tries to block with his axe, the turtle suddenly strikes again. Aruna noticed the earth dragon was leaking that nasty magic miasma again, and even from way back there, it was still hitting her, so she asked Diaz how he wasn't even affected. Diaz figures the monster isn't even fighting back anymore, so he just keeps wailing on that crack without saying a single word. Out of nowhere, the turtle's head snaps out to attack and fires a blast straight at Diaz. He realizes it's the first time anyone's ever cracked that turtle shell, so he starts attacking like a total maniac because this earth dragon is absolutely fuming. If he keeps this up, that loot is totally his. But then the monster suddenly lunges right at Aruna and she has to dive out of the way. DS sees her lying there totally still and screams her name at the top of his lungs. The monster hears him and charges straight for the girl. Aruna can only stare at the beast, completely paralyzed. Diaz realizes the monster isn't even after him. It's targeting Aruna, and now he's absolutely losing. He promised her he'd always be a real friend, so he's going to stand his ground against any monster, no matter how powerful it gets. Diaz lunges at the monster and shatters its shell into pieces. Realizing the beast is finally dead, he hops off and bolts straight to Aruna. He asks him if he'd... Out of nowhere, Aruna tackles DS into a massive hug while sobbing, and then she shocks everyone by saying she wants to marry him. Out of nowhere, voices start calling out to see if Aruna and Diaz are okay, since they've been gone for way too long. Suddenly, they spot the earth dragon's lifeless body, and right there next to it are DS and Aruna's. Diaz realized Aron's grip was way stronger than a dragon's, and since he couldn't break free, he begged him to just chill out and stop crying. Diaz and Arunas headed back to the village, and everyone's jaws dropped when they saw Diaz had actually taken down the earth dragon, especially since they were hauling its massive body behind them on it. DS realized this turtle was insanely heavy, and even with every guy in the village helping, they didn't get it back until the next morning. The chief turned to Diaz and said he never thought one guy could actually solo an earth dragon. She's blown away that the deadly magic mist didn't even touch them. Once they clean up the loot, most of it will stay in perfect shape. This stuff is worth a literal, for a small cut, they'll harvest the body for parts and build him a well and a massive warehouse. They're even throwing in a yard and extra storage for all the loot, and they can trade with the merchants who stop by to help the Lord make some solid connections. Right before the chief brings up Aruna's wedding gift. Her parents would be totally hyped if a guy brought them dragon loot, but Diaz stops her right there to ask what she means by a wedding gift. The chieftain is dead set on the wedding even if he's totally against it, but she's stressed that having a dragon slayer living right outside the village will make people uneasy. Plus, just imagine the crazy manly vibes he's giving off after slaying that dragon. If he turns Aruna down, every girl in the village is going to go into full battle mode to win him over. Out of nowhere, Diaz spots a little girl grabbing his leg, then he looks up and sees tons of girls all staring at the guy. The chief says the girls are just waiting around because they know kingdom guys only pick one wife, and they're all totally convinced Aruna is still a virgin. Diaz asked if he was seriously being forced to get married, since the chief was already busy setting up an engagement for him. The lady asked about the engagement, But she explained they don't even do that there, and Aruna had already gone to tell her parents she was getting married. All Diaz had to do was pick a date or find a deal they both liked, and just like that, he and Aruna were officially married. Aruna was basically perfect. She was gorgeous, super sweet, kept the house spotless, and treated him so well that he started thinking this might actually be a great idea. He's 35 and finally thinking about marriage, so he starts wondering how old Aruna actually is, and asks the guy next to him if he knows her age. The guy says he knows Aruna just hit 15 this year. He adds that Aruna got super lucky meeting Diaz right when she was old enough to get married. DS knew she'd be young, but they looked more like a father and daughter, even though the kingdom's law says she has to be 18. She won't be 18 for another 3 years, giving him plenty of time to become an awesome lord before they finally get married. He knows he can't just half-heartedly agree because that would be a total insult to her feelings. So he decides to go all in and prove his devotion as both her struggling leader and as a man. A whole month has passed since Aruna and Hugh got engaged, and after finishing their new well and warehouse, they're finally chilling and enjoying their upgraded lifestyle. But one thing is still the same. 0 new people have joined his field, and even though he's got some ideas to fix it, he's not even sure they'll actually work. He used to see Aruna as just another soldier for the Lord, but now she's family, and he's low-key wishing more people would just drop from the sky to help out. Out of nowhere, Aruna screams that they're having a baby, and Diaz is so shocked he literally drops his water jug. Diaz asks if she's 100% sure, and Aruna confirms they're finally having a baby, making them both scream at the top of their lungs in total victory. Later on, the guy was stuck babysitting Frances. He admitted he never expected her to get pregnant so fast. That's when Francois walked over to him. Diaz looked him in the eye. Diaz remembered Aruna saying the Memu were actually super smart and could understand humans, using their wits to survive in such a brutal world. It's actually insane that a wild Memu can learn to talk in just a week, and that's exactly how they chose to become domesticated all on their own. Since humans were giving them free food and a safe place to stay, they decided to just settle down and become totally domesticated. Arunas dropped some bad news, explaining that even though Mimas are super smart, they get totally terrified when they're pregnant, though sometimes that fear just completely disappears. They're sticking to Diaz like glue because he's the strongest, and being near him is the only way they can keep from freaking out. It was way worse at night while they were out cold. And even though Diaz claimed he totally got the situation and had to crash there, Arunas called him out immediately. Aruna told them they were moving into the yurt, but the guys were totally hating it because the place would get super gross and they couldn't even chill with Mamu constantly staring them down. Diaz was actually shocked it was this easy and told them he didn't mind at all, because Francis and Francois are family and he'd do anything for their baby. Arunas was super happy to hear that, realizing he was actually a really kind and manly guy after all. Diaz thinks all the Mimus sound exactly the same, but Aruna can hear tiny differences in their voices and totally gets them, even though Diaz is still completely lost. The girl asked Francis what she was even talking about, then Aruna spoke up and said she and Diaz weren't officially married yet, and she even told Francis that she was acting totally out of. Aruna asks what's wrong with them just hanging out to get closer, then she says everything is cool and she's being totally real with him. She told Mimu that everything was totally fine and to just stay out of their private business. Diaz spots a weird green glow on the girl's horn he's never seen before, and Aruna panics because the magic barrier just got triggered by a mysterious stranger heading their way. She realizes the riders are basically 10-year-old kids, while Diaz figures out that green glow near the horn means an invasion is heading east right toward the kingdom. He senses someone heading their way, and since bandits would be a total nightmare, he goes to investigate while Aruna uses her magic to hide their tracks. The guy looks at Mimu and tells her he'll be right back, since there are only 10 of these guys, and they definitely aren't tougher than a dragon. Aruna flashed a smile and told Diaz she'd handle the house, letting him know she was totally counting on him. The guy charges straight at the intruders, yelling that there are 3 on horseback and 4 on foot, but Aruna shuts him down and says there are actually 10 of them after counting the horses too. There's basically no way these guys are friendly, and while those bows could be a real pain, he's got a little surprise ready for them. Right until one of the warriors suddenly, the guy is totally hyped, and says it's been way too long, and that's when Diaz realizes it's Klaus, his old partner from the battlefield. Even though Klaus was just a commoner, Dia respected him so much he'd trust him with his life, and after a hyped-up reunion, Klaus explained he was now working as a guide. Klaus mentions some fancy nobles hit him up with a favor, but then he spots the girl and tries to figure out who she really is. Klaus asked the guy to lead them back to his place since everyone was totally wiped out from the long trip. Diaz asks what they mean by his property and says he'll take them straight to his house if that's the spot they're looking for. Klaus was totally hyped to finally see Diaz's domain and was already picturing how insane it would be. They eventually reach this flat field, and even though Diaz thought they'd hidden everything except their practice spot, he was totally shocked by how well the magic actually worked. It was seriously mine. Diaz swings the door open and tells everyone to quit being shy and get inside. But as they step into the yurt, they realize the place is totally empty. She introduces herself as Diana, the third princess, and tells Diaz she's super honored to finally meet a legendary hero like him. Diana asked what kind of tent this was, totally sure the guy's mansion was still being built, but she couldn't see or hear a single worker anywhere. Diaz tried to talk, but a knight shut him down, calling him a fool and telling him to address the princess as Diana while putting him right back in his place. Diana orders the knight to stand down, and Diaz admits he's got no workers or property, just this one tent he literally bled for while building it with his own two hands. Everyone's jaws dropped as Diana asked if he really built the whole thing with his own two hands, but when she looked around for his crew, Diaz just told her there's nobody. She asks why he doesn't just hire some locals, especially since the king gave Diaz a massive budget and a huge hero's reward to fix up the land. Diaz said he knew, but he hadn't seen a single penny, any cash to build the place, or even basic supplies. He thought he was going to die like a stray dog in the dirt, even though there wasn't even a road around, and Klaus was absolutely fuming when he heard that. Diaz asks Diana why she's there, and she tells him the war needs its hero back in action. Things are getting super intense in the kingdom, so she tracks down the hero and begs him to use his crazy powers to help her out. Diana told him he could marry her, or he could pick one of the girls behind her, Priscilla or Murda, to be his wife. Diaz thinks about the war and figures she's got to be joking, because there's no way she's leaving Francis now, plus he's totally lost on why she'd want to marry some guy she literally just met. He thinks he's already got Aruna, so he tells Diana he's got other plans and is officially quitting the war. He can't help them out with an army because, as you can see, this lord doesn't have a single soldier left to send. Diana gritted her teeth and begged the guy to change his mind, even promising to throw in a massive extra reward. Diaz says he's sorry, but he won't help no matter what the reward is, and since that's that, he tells everyone to get lost. The knight started roasting him, yelling that the princess herself asked for help and he had some nerve turning her down. Klaus tried to stop the guy, but he wouldn't listen and just called Diaz way too cocky. In a total flash, Diaz smashed the knight's sword with his axe, leaving everyone stunned as a sharp shard flew right past Klaus, who was completely frozen in place. Diaz could totally feel the guy's killer vibes, so he strikes a pose to try and freak him out. He drops his axe and tells everyone the talk is over. It's time. Klaus rushed over and told them they had to get out of there fast, warning the guy to keep his mouth shut or things were going to get ugly. Cloud smirks and tells them they don't stand a chance even if they team up, then asks if they're seriously ready to take on a hero like him. Diaz was totally losing his mind, and after realizing he'd gone way too far, he smashed the floor to pieces while the guy nearby started shaking because he knew Aruna was going to. Diana realized the vault was bone dry and the army was nowhere to be found, which was nothing like what she was promised, so she straight up called Diaz a total failure. She screams at him for tossing her aside like literal garbage and swears she's going to make him regret the day he ever messed with her. Diaz watched them leave, and then Arunas pointed out that all the women were glowing red, while one soldier was glowing blue and the rest were just red or white. She asked the guy if she'd totally freaked him out. She knew Francis was going to start crying, and she totally did, so she just wanted to stay close to him. Diaz pulled Francis into a hug and apologized for leaving. Then the rest of the group walked over and he started giving everyone head pats. Diaz says the girls glowing red are totally hostile, so does that mean Arunatu is in serious danger? Arunas warns that the court proved they're both in huge trouble just because they're family, and Diaz knows she's totally right. He realizes these three are actually enemies, so he knows all that talk about war and marriage was a total lie, and he's glad he kicked them out. Arunas mentioned a soldier was glowing blue, probably just from the clouds, and Diaz smiled as he remembered his friend's kind face. Aruna points out the floor is a total wreck and needs fixing, and Dia just nods like he's got the whole situation figured out. A little while later, the floor is finally fixed, and Diaz wakes up to some movement as the guy says good morning to Francis and Francois. Aruna was whipping up some breakfast and said good morning as she served the food, but then her horn suddenly started glowing. Aruna warns everyone that there's an intruder, and since it's just one guy, she can see he's over in the east looking totally lost and just walking in circles. Diaz asks if he's actually alone since he doesn't look like a traveler. Then later, while Diaz is outside, Arunakam suddenly shows up with Francis and Francois as the guy asks if the girl is coming with them. Aruna tells him there's only one enemy, so it's no big deal. And since they're going to be super stealthy, they'll be totally fine. Plus, she's not about to let Francis start crying, so she's coming along whether he likes it or not. Diaz grins and tells the girl she's right. Then after a bit, he starts heading across the field where he spots a familiar face and asks Klaus if it's really him, Klaus admitted he was totally lost after trying to find his way back, and Dia pointed out there was nothing but grass to guide them, especially since he thought Klaus had already taken the girls back to the bus. Diaz asks what happened to his gear, but Klaus just laughs, saying he got kicked out and wants his sword and armor back, leaving Diaz totally stunned. He asked if they were really his own people and if they were back because he'd just kicked them out, but Cloud told him that wasn't it and it was actually what he wanted. Klaus asked Diaz if he was even listening to what they told him. Another war was starting to brew in the kingdom. If the fighting broke out, he'd be sent right back. This wasn't part of his plan at all, so he used the chance to find a buddy while chasing the one dream he wants more than anything else. Diaz asks Klaus what he's so hyped to do, and Klaus tells him straight up that he wants a job as one of his soldiers. Diaz felt like they fought with total trust, and since Klaus is the one person he relies on most, he's just glad they're on the same team. Diaz is totally stressing and shaking his head, but then Aruna pops up and tells him everything's cool if he's just worried about her. Klaus has been glowing with a weird blue light this whole time while talking to the guy, and he nearly jumps out of his skin when Aruna suddenly appears. Aruna asks Diaz if he wants to talk things over, and as she gives him a warm smile, he beams right back at her. Klaus asked about the lady and the sheep, but Diaz told him it's a long story, and just like that, Diaz officially scored his very first subject. Back in the war, Klaus begged his captain to wait, asking if he was really going to ditch everyone and run, but the captain just said they were pulling back to get some backup. Klaus looked the guy in the eye and asked who'd stop the enemy if they ran, knowing the nearby shelter was packed with women and children. The captain just shouts that it's all up to fate and bolts, while Clouds desperately screams for him to wait up. Mainu was busy munching on grass, and Aruna was whipping up some food, while Diaz and Klaus teamed up to build Klaus a brand new yurt. Diaz said he was cool with the yurt, but since he totally trashed it, they couldn't just leave him with a wreck and decided to build him a brand new one instead. Aruna called the guys over and sent them to grab some dinner, but DS was totally shocked when he suddenly spotted a black buffalo. Everyone gathers around for dinner, and while DS thanks Aruna for the meal and tells Klaus to quit yawning, Klaus just says the food is so good it's fit for a lord. Klaus tells Aruna she'd be an amazing wife, and DS totally agrees. So Aruna tells him to keep stuffing his face since there's tons of food, and Klaus gives. Diaz walks up to Aruna to talk gear, telling her they've got enough dragon parts to craft some seriously epic weapons and armor. Aruna says they can either do that or stick to the village's plan of making Nekatorai, since every single part of a dragon is super useful and they aren't letting anything go to waste. They're crafting swords and bows from the fangs and claws while turning shells into shields, but Diaz says trading in the village will use up even more gear. Diaz notices Klaus looking weird and asks what's up. So Klaus asks if he really mentioned a dragon, and when Diaz says yeah, Klaus drops the bomb that he's already killed. Diaz calls this thing an earth dragon, and he actually smashed its shell and killed it, even though it's just a giant turtle that can't even fly. Which is crazy because Klaus thought it. Klaus can't believe Diaz is dropping such rare loot on him, but Diaz just tells him straight up that he wants Klaus to lead his future army. What's the point if they're just lying there? Klaus is totally stunned, but he tells Diaz he's got his back and is even ready to die for him. Klaus tells Diaz and Aruna he'll protect their land from anyone. And even though Diaz asks him to stop being so formal, Klaus says he has to show the man some respect. Diaz was stoked to see Klaus so hyped about the gear, and it wasn't long before Klaus was already out there putting his new armor and spear to the test. 10 days later, the spear and armor are finally finished. They're made entirely out of dragon parts and are so insanely expensive that Klaus thinks even a king couldn't afford them. Klaus thinks back to Diaz and realizes how much the guy really trusts him, so he's determined to actually live up to those big expectations. Right now, the capital is a total disaster because everyone's fighting over who gets to sit on the throne. Every noble family is busy picking sides and plotting against each other, just like they do. While traveling, Klaus saw how messed up Lord Kazdex is, and it looks like the greedy second prince actually stole Diaz's reward. Word is the third Princess Diana has way more political pull than actual soldiers, so she's definitely trying to charm Diaz into joining her side. This fight for the throne is about to wreck the whole country, and that's exactly why he finally showed up. If Klaus has to go back to war, he knows he might not survive, but he's totally fine with dying if it's for Diaz, and he gets to go out like a hero. Klaus spots Diaz holding a gun and walks right up to him to ask what the heck happened. Diaz says Aruna caught 12 guys sneaking in from the east, and since one of them is literally dying, he's got to rush over there right now while Klaus asks if he should tag along. Diaz tells Klaus to stay put, because if things get too dangerous, Aruna and Maimu are going to run back and he needs to be there to protect them. Klaus says he's totally in, so Diaz and Aruna head out while she covers their tracks with a thick layer of fog. Klaus realized it was Aruna's hiding magic when they just melted away, and he was totally blown away by how insane her power was. Klaus is totally thrown off when he sees Diaz and Aruna back way earlier than expected, especially since they're leading a group of random strangers. A little while later, Aruna was busy helping the elderly and bringing them some food. Dia realized it looked like these old women had been totally abandoned. Since things were getting desperate, the pawn, Duke Kazdix's second son, actually kicked off a massive rebellion. He's trying to take out his useless father and the guy next in line for the throne. That whole neighboring area is... Granny Maya is the boss of this whole group, and she used her magic visions to find a safe path and lead everyone on this massive journey. While Diaz screams to Klaus that Diaz was hyped to score 12 new recruits in just one day, while Klaus was already rehearsing exactly what he was about to say. Since they're exiled, he can do whatever he wants with them, but they're way too old to help out much considering they're all in their 70s and Grandma Maya is literally 90. These guys live for so long he's hoping they'll spill their secret, but Klaus asks Diaz if they could actually drop dead any second, and that's the whole reason they got kicked out. Diaz grabs the logs and says they need more tents, making Klaus flash back to that day years ago when the whole village found out the enemy had taken over their camp. They couldn't just bail and let the village get wiped out, but Klaus was left totally stranded and realized the enemy was already there to end him. Out of nowhere, Diaz pops up, totally hyped to see Klaus, and says that since everyone else bailed, he thought he was all alone. So Klaus asks him where the heck Diaz heard a baby crying, so he went to check it out and ended up with the boy in his arms. Diaz headed to the shelter to find someone to take the boy, but the kid started sobbing and begged him not to leave because he was totally terrified. DS flashed a grin and told the kid not to be scared because he's got his back, asking him to just hang tight for a little longer. Diaz slammed the shelter shut and stood up to face the angry soldiers charging their way. Then he turned to Klaus and told him not to die, making the nervous guy quickly agree. Everything after that is a total blur. Standing next to Diaz with the shelter at his back, he swings his sword with every bit of strength he has left. He couldn't even tell how. He was sure that hanging back would let Diaz wipe out the enemy way easier. It was definitely their best play at the time. But when the backup finally rolled in the next day, the enemy... Klaus realized Diaz hadn't changed a bit, because even after becoming a total big shot, he was still the same kind and honest guy he'd always been. Klaus looked at the crowd and realized he'd been a total idiot. He used to think he needed some big, honorable death. Now he knew he had to stay alive and stick bys. Klaus told Diaz he'd help him out, but warned him to stop pulling so hard before he totally ripped the yurt apart. A few days later, Aruna checked the old lady's souls and saw they were a safe blue. So with the group growing fast, they finally started brainstorming a name for their new village. Then someone suggests naming it Eluk, a classic name that literally means the first village. Klaus bursts in and suggests naming it Dragon Slayer Village, but Aruna shuts him down while Diaz realizes that's exactly how his first village was born. Everyone was hyped to celebrate, so they threw a chill little party, and even though Diaz kept it low-key, seeing all those happy faces finally made her crack a smile. He's got to do his best to keep everyone happy, so Aruna walks up and asks for a second of his time to talk about the massive population growth. She apologized for the interruption, but said they needed to settle this right now, asking the guy what he thought about their earlier talk. Diaz remembered their talk about bringing in new settlers, but he was totally blanking on any good ideas. He had a plan, but he ditched it instantly since Grandma Maya's way was way faster and easier, and right then, Maya walks up to Diaz and asks if he actually called her. She heard him calling her name, but Diaz was positive he hadn't said a word, and then she told him she wanted to finish their talk from last night. She asked why he was so against having servants, since selling dragon loot would give him enough cash to buy a massive crew and grow the population in no time. Diaz figured this was all Grandma Maya's idea. See, when someone sells their soul, they're basically just a servant. These guys are so cheap that the village can actually afford to buy. Dia was totally done with the ministry after seeing the absolute nightmare of servant soldiers being used on the battlefield. He could have just been nice to his servants, but Diaz fired back that the real problem was buying them at all. Whenever the servants sell out, the merchants just rush to restock. If they see him buying them up, they'll just go out and snatch even more people. He knows for a fact these Diaz made it official that no one could own or sell servants on her land, and Maya was super relieved to find out he totally hated slavery. She said someone probably thought about buying servants just to get the population up, and even though she was ready to fight that idea, she's just relieved it didn't come to that. Diaz told the woman to just speak her mind if she was bothered, and Maya agreed he was totally right. Maya's heard all the crazy stories about Kazdex's servants, and she's so hit by her feelings that she actually apologizes to the guy. Diaz told her not to sweat it because he'd never let that go down, and Aruna asked if he actually had a secret plan ready. Right then, Klaus butts in to ask if Diaz is actually with Aruna, mumbles a quick sorry telling them to carry on, but then he spots Maya and panics, claiming he didn't see anything. Aruna sprints over to Diaz and tells him she spotted a merchant on the path, so Diaz says they've got to get moving right now. They're totally hyped for these traders to show up, not just to swap gear, but to spread the word about their home and dig for some intel, especially since even Diaz never seen these mysterious guys before. The merchant walks up, but Diaz is totally floored when he sees a giant frog standing there instead of a human. And then the creature asks if he's really the legendary dragon slayer from all. The merchant introduces himself as Pigeon and wants to make a deal, but Arunus reveals he's actually a frog, leaving everyone totally shocked. Pigeon heard that Diaz actually took down an earth dragon, so he asked to see the loot to see how good it really was. Aruna checks Pigeon's soul and sees it's white, meaning he's not a threat. He's only here for business, but he's definitely not. Diaz shows off a piece of the dragon's shell and asks if there's a problem. But Pagan admits he expected the beast to be way smaller since Diaz took it down all by himself. He says sorry for being a jerk and asks if he really took down that earth dragon solo, while Dia wonders if Paijin just thinks he stumbled onto a dead body. He realizes the merchant is totally onto him, which is bad news. So he tells Klaus to drop that dividing shell while he goes to grab his axe. Diaz comes back with an axe and shatters the dragon's shell into a bunch of pieces with just one crazy swing. Paige is totally blown away while Cloud screams that he saw the killing blow, and DS realizes that the dragon's shell is definitely the hardest part to break down. He just wanted to help the others with their work, so he grabbed his axe and marched right up to the shell. A few days later, he finally figured out how to shatter the shell in just one hit. But when Klaus told him to call it the Dragon Slayer Strike, Diaz realized his friend was actually trash at tea. Klaus turns to Paige and asks if he actually believes him, but Paige just wants to know if he can buy those broken shell pieces. He tells the crew to start unloading the cart because cash alone won't cover the bill, and they get right to work. Pajin says he'll find a way to pay for it, and since he's a legit merchant, he's going to figure out exactly what it's worth. Paige then tells his crew to bring someone else out, figuring that since he can't sell monsters on Earth, a human like Mr. Diaz might actually be down to buy them. Out of nowhere, two elf twins stepped out of the carriage holding hands, but their eyes looked totally empty and dead. Aruna, Klaus, and Maya's faces totally dropped, and Paige knew right then he'd messed up big time. He saw how mad Diaz was as Diaz stared into the twins' empty eyes, realizing they were orphans just like him and remembering Paige's warning that they couldn't even be sold. Diaz realized Pagan was actually selling these twins like they were just products. But before he could lose it, Aruna grabbed his hand and told him to stay cool. Maya said Diaz looked scary enough to give the kids nightmares. So the woman told Mr. Page they weren't there to buy servants, leaving Page totally shocked and demanding to know what was going on. He said the twins weren't servants, and if he hadn't taken them in as property, they would have been dead a long time ago. These two were born as twins right in their village, but the locals treated twins like cursed monsters from an animal's belly that brought nothing but bad luck. Because of that, they were actually scheduled to, but their parents weren't having any of it, so they grabbed their kids and bolted from the village to hide forever, and that's right when Paige ran into them. Living in the woods was super dangerous, and when both parents got hit with a deadly sickness, they begged Piscine to take their kids before it was too late. Paige is a traveling merchant, so he shut them down and said he doesn't do freebies. Then the parents actually begged him to take the twins away like they were just some items for sale. Paige was down for it, because when they were literally dying and begging him with every last cent they had, he just couldn't say no. He promised to keep them safe until he could sell them to a decent buyer, since nobody actually cares about kids with a curse. He's totally broke now, so taking care of them is just a massive waste of money. But then he runs into DS and starts apologizing like crazy because he never meant to hurt any. Aruna used her horn to see that Pagan wasn't lying, and she realized these kids actually had super bright blue souls. Diaz agreed to take the kids, offering up dragon parts to cover all the costs and keep them safe, and Paige thought it was a total win. Diaz was acting tough about buying them, but since they have nowhere else to go, he's taking the twins in as his subjects, or better yet, his new family. Once they left the plains, a hyped-up Parisian called Diaz his best customer ever for selling out all their stock, and he honestly loved how easy it was to deal with simple-minded guys. The shirtless guy asked Paige if this dude would get in the Beast King's way, but Paige promised it was totally fine. This guy was totally chill in his tiny village and didn't suspect a thing, never thinking for a second that Diaz would actually mess with these kids. But here's the thing. If Master Diaz keeps making his village bigger, he's definitely going to run into those mountains up north eventually. Sure, these mountains are crawling with monsters, but they're also packed with insane amounts of rare minerals. If he can grab this land, his business partners are going to be absolutely loaded. Piggin says that since he's the trusted merchant, he's definitely getting a fat cut of the profits no matter what. Diaz totally nailed his first deal with Pagan, so he immediately set up the next trade and started looking for new people to join his land. Diaz suddenly marched over to the twins and scooped them both up. He had a huge smile on his face as he asked them how old they were. They were way too thin, so he decided. He tells them Aruna is a beast in the kitchen, and they should all grab a meal together. Then he introduces himself, asks for their names, and even wonders if they have a favorite game they can all play. The guy kept trying to act all nice, asking about their favorite foods, songs, and even toys. But when he asked for their names again, the girls just gave him total silence. Since their parents gave up everything and left home for them, these kids obviously love them back, so they should really treasure the names their parents gave them. He asks if they don't have names and realizes he's going to have to name them all over again. And even though he looks sketchy, he's actually a total pro at naming kids. The girls got totally freaked out and shut him down, but Diaz really needed to know who they were and asked for their names. The girls introduced themselves as Sene and Ichin, and while Aruno is totally shocked to hear them speak, Diaz just thanks them and tells them they're super cute. He's seen way too many kids shut themselves off from the world, and he knows it almost always ends in a total nightmare. Making them remember their parents was the perfect way to finally get them to crack. Diaz tells Klaus they've got to sort through all this loot, so while they're busy, Aruna and Granny Maya are going to help them get into their new outfits and then whip up some food. The twins agree and head out with Aruna and Maya, who tells them to follow along while Maya promises some tasty steamed potatoes later. Klaus is totally blown away that Diaz is a natural with kids, but Diaz explains that back before the war, he actually ran a home for orphans and even raised a newborn baby. Klaus asks about the names, and Diaz explains there were 10 kids he left with a caretaker before heading to war, just hoping they're all doing okay now. Klaus hoped that word would spread so they'd eventually show up. Then he checked the loot and hauled it all to the warehouse until the job was finally finished. Aruna, Maya, Sina, and Ikin meet up with Diaz and Klaus. But Senna and Ikin are rocking totally new outfits. And Diaz is so hyped he reaches out to tell them how adorable they look. Aruna calls out Diaz for being a total mess, and since he knows she's right, he and Clace head straight to the stream to wash all that grime away. A little while later, they headed back to the group, and the girls were rocking these awesome braids the locals did for them, while Arunas told them they'd be able to do it themselves. Maya realized right then that these twins weren't even human, but she felt like they were a lucky charm. And since they were so stinking cute, she decided to take care of them. Diaz walks up and tells Shania and Ion their new hair looks totally fire. So the girls start flexing their jewelry and talking about how pretty it is, making Diaz realize they're finally starting to come out of their shells. Aruna calls Sinai and Icon over to give them some jewelry, explaining that in an ancient language, Sinai means beautiful as the moon, and Icon means sacred. She doesn't really get why their parents chose those names, but she's positive they were tied to the moon, which is why they were given these Iwa gems packed with lunar power that they owe. Sinai and Ihan share the meanings behind their names, but thinking about their parents makes them both burst into tears. They remembered promising to love their girls with everything they had and just wanting them to be happy forever. The girls rush over to give DS and Aruna a massive hug, and as Mimel joins DS, Aruna points out that she wants to help too since they're all total pros at cheering up kids. As soon as the girls spot Mimu, they sprint over for a massive hug, while Diaz reminds Aruna that she used that ancient language to name the village, which is wild, because he wonders if Senai and Aishin's parents were actually linked to those mysterious people, But Aruna has no clue since that ancient language is basically just a myth, and she's not. Aruna drops a bombshell that the girl's parents weren't even human. It turns out their ancestors probably mixed with the only people way back in the day. Then they spot the bee. 10 days have gone by, and even though Seen and Ehin are still heartbroken over their parents, they're finally moving forward and filling the village with their smiles and laughter once again. The whole village started treating them like their own kids. But then the girls gave me a totally different look right as Aruna warned Diaz that a guy on a horse was riding in from the east. Aruna warns that he's going to be here any second, and Diaz spots them coming from the east again, so he heads out to meet them while the man calls for Aruna, Francis. Mimu starts chatting with someone, and Arunus explains that they're actually sticking around this time because they hate being away from the DS. And since Sinai and Econ are finally here, they just want to stay with them. Dia told them he was counting on their quick return, but then the girls suddenly marched right up to the man. Scene told Diaz to get back home as fast as he could since they'd be waiting for him. And Diaz just flashed a smile and agreed. Diaz stood out in the open waiting for the guy, while Aruna used her magic to hide in the fog. And she quickly warned him the second the man arrived. She took one look at the old man and told him his soul was pure white, so he definitely wasn't looking for a fight. The guy catches up to Diaz, hops off his horse, and apologizes for dropping in out of nowhere, calling Diaz his master as he guesses who he's looking at. Diaz asks who the heck he is, and the guy says his name is Camelot, and he's there representing Duke Kazdex. Eldon Kazdex is already on his way to see Lord Diaz, and even though he offered to bring him back to his place, Diaz says they're meeting right here. The guy looks up and catches Diaz's terrifying glare, so he quickly bows and promises to deliver the message to his lord. Diaz was convinced Eldon Kazdex was the player who sparked the entire civil war. There was no way he was letting a guy like that get anywhere near Eluk village. A bit later, they spotted a massive cart that totally confused Aruna. But she noticed the big guy there had a glowing blue soul, while everyone else was a total mix with 0 red souls in sight. Diaz is totally shocked and asks why the guy is glowing blue. So Arunus explains his aura is the strongest she's ever seen, second only to Diaz himself. The guy hopped off the cart and apologized like crazy, saying he just really needed to see Diaz. The guy introduced himself as Eldon Kazdex, but told Diaz to just call him Eldon, and since he grew up hearing all the legends about the hero, he was basically his biggest fan. He explained that he just wanted to meet the guy and get to know him without causing any trouble, so he told Diaz to just chill out. D.A. hoped old Eldon wasn't mad, and apologized for being a jerk to his guy, but Eldon told him to drop the formalities because he was just hyped to finally meet him. Eldon suddenly asks who the girl hiding off to the side is, which totally freaks Aaron out. Eldon says she's great at staying hidden, but his super sharp ears and nose. Diaz is totally shocked that Eldon saw through the illusion, so Aruna decides to reveal herself, and Eldon immediately starts grilling her about who she is and what her deal is with Diaz. Dia introduces the girl as Aruna and says they're engaged, but she insists she's actually his wife and he totally goes along with it. Eldon asks if she's an Ajin, but Aruna explains she's just an Oni born with a horn and has absolutely no clue what an Ajin even is. Elvan says Ajin are basically anyone who looks human but isn't, like beastmen and mermaids. Aruna asks if it's for real because that would make her an Ajon, but then Eldon suddenly starts crying. Eldon literally tackles Diaz into a hug and asks if he and Aruna have a kid. But Diaz just asks why he's crying and tells him they don't have any children. Aruna's dreaming of having 10 kids, while Diaz just took in 2 orphans she's sure Eldon would call Jin. Eldon yelled to everyone that Diaz had an Ajin wife and kids, even calling him his literal soulmate. Out of nowhere, Eldon's ears get huge and he sprouts a trunk, using it to lift DS into the air, while Aruna and DS freak out because an adjunct should. Back when Eldon was a kid, the capital hyped everyone up for war with epic hero stories that eventually turned into massive stage plays. He'd never heard this legend before, but apparently, Diaz honored his parents' dying wish by crushing the strong and saving the weak, even using his fists to force those corrupt nobles to change their. The nobles hated this, so they shut down the shows after a week and then banned them for good, making the whole city absolutely furious. Everyone started passing around these tablets filled with the crazy stories from the speeches, and they even made it all the way to Kazdex, which is super far from the capital. The catch was that the story he heard was mostly fake, and it didn't say a single word about a noble being on the battlefield. Elton wasn't just going to believe the hype, but literally everyone who saw Diaz in action, from the grizzled veterans to the merchants and even the tutors, had nothing but amazing things to say about him. That's exactly why he started looking up to Diaz. But then Eldon was suddenly told to stop pushing himself so hard. DS felt like Eldon was lugging him around like a heavy crate, so he was totally wiped out. But the whole squad teamed up and went all out to find him. Diaz asks if Eldon is really paralyzed, and the man reveals he's actually a half-Aijin, a rare human-Aijin hybrid who has the crazy power to transform into an Ajin. His dad is an ex-lord named Kazdex Enkus. His mom is Neha, a slave from the elephant tribe. Whenever he transforms, his power level totally drops. DS actually thought he was Eldon's half-gene side is a huge power-up, but his human half comes with some major issues, like how he's tiny for an elephant person but totally jacked for a human. His body is a total wreck, and the only reason he's still standing is because his wives are constantly looking after him. Then you've got Camelot, and the way the Ajin are treated in Kastek is so messed up it's hard to even describe, which honestly just breaks Eldon. Eldon dreamed of a world where every race lived together in peace, so he set out to build it while the Lord's son used his high status to secretly protect the assistant from the shadows. That rumor Diaz heard about Eldon being a total ladies' man was probably just a fake story to cover up the truth. Arunas had one big question. Why didn't Anka enslave Eldon like the rest of the Ajin? Even if Eldon was his own son, being half-A, she asked why Ankus wanted to enslave every single Ajin, and Kamlut confirmed that Eldon would be treated like a servant, just like Neha. Inkas was married to a woman named Jania, and they already had an older son also named Jania, who looked exactly like his dad and had a trash personality because of his ugly face. Ankus didn't care about Johnny even though they looked the same, but once the handsome Eldon was born in human form, he immediately claimed the kid was his just to grab more power. Diaz realized this whole thing was just a sick, twisted joke because he hated the kid who looked like him and liked the other one better. But the scariest part was that he couldn't feel any love at all. Eldon had no idea he was actually an origin, and nobody else suspected a thing either. Neha stayed right by his side, serving him and making sure he was okay. But then he turned. Right then, it finally clicked for Eldon that Neha was actually his mom. After that, the two of them started getting way closer. Now, Eldon's main mission was to build. The S heard rumors about a civil war and wondered if things were really that bad. But Camelot explained that Eldon was just trying to keep his friends safe. Jania and her crew snitched on the real plan, which made Ankus totally lose it and order a hit on Eldon, Neha, and every other agent, so Eldi. After a brutal war, Eldon totally crushed Ankus and his crew, and even though he was a total fake, he took over as the new lord of the Kazdex domain. Eldon begged Diaz for forgiveness, pointing out that since he just married an Ajin he barely knew, all his kids would end up being Ajin too. Aruna's living her absolute best life. He's totally sure her kids are going to be just as happy as she is. But honestly, when he first met her, he completely misread her. Diaz is totally down with Eldon's dream because humans and Ajin already live in peace back at his village, and he thinks it would be awesome if the whole world could be just like that. So he's going to back them up and help however he can, telling Eldon that his dream is seriously massive. The guy thumps his chest and tells Eldon to stand tall, asking him if being brave is actually worth it. And Eldon finally stops crying to get a grip on himself. Diaz and Eldon chatted about all sorts of things for a while until they eventually started comparing the food supplies in their lands. Eldon pulls Diaz aside and warns him that they're in big trouble if they can't store more food. Because with the village population exploding, they're definitely going to run out unless they start producing way more. Winter is coming fast, so they need to start prepping right now or they're in big trouble. Diaz was sure he'd already told them this. Plus, Eldon is really... He decides they're going to start by prepping a field for planting. Since he was a farmer before the war, he's about to show everyone his pro skills. He just needs to set. Diaz and Aruna finally get back home where Meimu, Senai, and Icon are waiting, and the girls immediately start screaming at Diaz for lying about coming right back. The guy admitted it was true, but even though he had a reason for being late, he knew anything he said would just sound like a total excuse. Sinai and Ahin were already totally knocked out in bed, and Arunas was just shocked they finally crashed after being so hyper for so long. Diaz figured these kids were just being super hyper, but he'd always been convinced this whole peaceful village thing was a total act. One day, I caught Sine eating her potatoes and she started bawling because Ahan wouldn't forgive her, while Diaz tried his best to stop the drama. Diaz tried to play peacemaker by offering up his potatoes, but she wasn't having it, making him realize their sister rivalry was just way too intense. After a night full of tears and crazy drama, even Aruna was totally shocked when the sun came up. Out of nowhere, the girls caught a massive fever, and after Aruna spent the whole night looking after them, Sinai started crying out for her mom, which made Aruna break down too. Diaz figured those rough days were actually helping the girls grow, and once they got through all that drama, Sini and Ahan finally started acting better and couldn't stop smiling. Out of nowhere, Aruna asks Diaz if they should just chew the girls out for once. Diaz shuts that idea down immediately. He says if they did that, they'd be the ones breaking their... Instead of scolding them, they should be apologizing, because kids starting their own families are just curious and want to check on the adults, and he thinks they should totally just lean into that. She knows this is totally messing them up, so starting tomorrow, she's going to stop being soft and finally set them straight. Suddenly, Aruna senses a massive group closing in from the southeast, and Diaz asks if she's totally sure these are those non-human Eldons. The girl says Eldon already headed home, but he took a different path, and since it's late, he's probably running straight into some sketchy thugs or bandits. Dia didn't care how dark it was and insisted on checking things out, and even though he told Aruna to stay and protect the group, she refused to let him go alone. Aruna points out it's a new moon, so it's totally pitch black outside. Without any help, there's no way DS is going to find them hiding in the tall grass. DS says he gets it and tells Aaron to follow him so she can hand over her power. The mercenary realize that the rich Oni have so many Mimu heads they can literally just live off the money they bring in. He realized only the broke guys go hunting, and they have to pay a massive fee just to get married. He knew hunting bandits was the fastest way to make bank, but they almost never showed up in this area. This merc thinks it's totally weird to put in this much work for a basic field of grass, so he's convinced these guys are up to something big. He spins around and asks if anyone actually lives in this place, since there isn't even a single tree in sight. This blonde dude walks right up and tells the guy to shut his mouth. This dude claims he dropped a fortune on these mercenaries and warns them to stop yapping or they'll have to give all that cash back. The guy throws his hands up and says he gets it, promising to do a perfect job, but he asks why they have to do it in the middle of the night. He asks the mercs if they've heard of the hero Diaz, warning them that this guy is a beast who wins open fights in broad daylight and could jump them when they least expect it. The mercenary pulls a face, but he doesn't say a single word. He tells the mercs to take out a guy named Eldon who's meeting Diaz in the meadows, but the mercenary just wants to know how much he's getting paid for the job. This guy says he'll drop 100 silver for Eldon and 10 whole gold coins for Diaz. The mercenary just stares at the dude, totally blown away by what he's seeing. He grabs the torch and orders his crew to move out, hyped that Diaz is going to be their biggest score in forever. He tells them they're going to finish the job and head home with massive bags. He spots a light heading right for them, and the mercenary is totally confused by this weird red glow in the dark. Out of nowhere, an arrow slams right into a mercenary's shoulder, making him scream in total shock and pain. The guy is swearing up a storm because Lyle got hit, and he's totally ticked off his sneak attack was caught. So he points ahead and shouts that the arrows are coming from that red light. The mercenary boss screams at his crew to ditch their torches and start firing arrows, pointing right at a glowing red light. That red light keeps on moving, but the second it vanishes, the guy drops into a fighting stance. Out of nowhere, an arrow slams right into one of the merc's legs. He lets out a massive scream. Their leader starts panicking and yells to find out where that shot even came from. The mercenary leader was totally blown away by how good this guy was. He had no clue how they even found where they were hiding. He really thought this was going to be a total walk in the eat. He screams at his squad to join the fight and make sure they don't lose sight of their target. The mercs start spraying bullets everywhere as their leader screams that they'll win the second they find out where the guy is hiding. The mercs heard a voice up ahead. Their leader just smirked. He pointed his sword and yelled for his crew to grab the target before they could escape. One merc asks where the enemy is, but a second later they all get slammed and sent flying across the field. The mercenary boss freezes right in his tracks. All he can hear are the brutal screams of his own men. He can't even wrap his head around how his entire squad got wrecked so fast. The mercenary captain brags that they've got way more guys, so he tells his squad to get in formation and just wait. His crew jumped in to help, but they got totally wrecked and sent flying all over the place. The merc leader spotted a creepy green glow in the shadows. He froze, trying to wrap his head around what he was seeing. Then it clicked. This was definitely an agent. A massive dark figure suddenly pops up right in the mercenary's face, but he reacts fast and blocks the strike with his sword. Sparks flew as they clashed, and the leader stared right into his enemy's eyes to see who he was actually up against. That's when it clicked. The guy was actually Diaz. I saw his bright blue eyes, that massive armor, and his giant two-handed axe. Diaz boots the guy, and as the mercenary leader starts swearing his head off, he realizes this kid is worth way more than 100 gold coins. Meanwhile, the guy who hired Diaz is booking it through the woods, desperately looking for a place to hide. He's in total shock that his mercenaries got wiped out so fast. He's freaking. The kid sprints behind the tree and vanishes, but suddenly something feels totally wrong and he hits the ground screaming and cursing. The kid was absolutely fuming and blamed Diaz for every single thing that went wrong. He couldn't understand why Diaz didn't just take him out right away, and there was no way Ease tried to tell the torchmen to go on the attack, but they just kept swinging like crazy until the fight was over, and when a stray arrow grazed Aruna's face and made her bleed, the bandits were left in rough shape, and while Diaz was annoyed that one guy managed to escape, the man didn't think he was worth chasing after. Diaz and his squad snatched up all the bandits' weapons, and after roasting them for being so incredibly stupid, he kicked them right off the plains. Aruna was totally ticked off and thought just kicking them out was way too easy, but Diaz felt it was fair since no one actually got hurt. Diaz warned the bandits that if they ever stepped foot on his land again, he was going to absolutely wreck them. Aruna thinks hunting down bandits is the perfect gig. She's convinced it's the fastest way to make some serious bank. She says they can grab a fat reward from the village chief. Diaz stared at those busted weapons, wondering if they could actually trade that junk for some quick cash. Diaz knew iron was worth a fortune in the plains, and since Aruna knew it could be turned into epic weapons or tools, she was dead set on selling every single piece they found. Aruna's family was pretty broke, so she dreamed of hunting down bandits to finally make some real money. Diaz looked at her and remembered that before they met, Aranim actually survived by hunting and patrolling the wild plains. Diaz knew hunting bandits was the fastest way to get rich quick, but since they were super rare on these plains, finding a big group was going to be a total nightmare. Out of nowhere, Aruna's horn starts glowing like crazy. The girl remembers her heart racing the moment she felt Diaz approaching in his carriage. She was totally convinced that bandits were finally. Diaz figured out Aruna could sense his every move, but she just saw Diaz as some weak refugee her crew kicked out and thought he was a total goner. The next day, Aruna went to check on Diaz during her patrol, but seeing him passed out on the ground looking so peaceful totally left her speechless. Just to be safe, she decides to check his soul, knowing that if it turns out blue, it's going to be a total waste. Aruna straight up says that if Diaz was actually abandoned, she wouldn't have spared him and would have just swiped all his gear and armor. Diaz was totally shocked that Aruna actually woke him up to talk, especially since she didn't even know why she was doing it herself. Diaz chose Aruna and totally stands by it, even if they still have those moments where they just don't get each other. Diaz kept his eyes on Aruna while she stared way off into the distance. Aruna spins around with a massive blush, asking him why she'd even want to date him. But Diaz just looks at her totally confused, asking what's wrong because he has absolutely no idea what's going on. Right then, she walks straight up to him and plants a kiss on his cheek. Diaz stared at her in total shock, while Aruna looked back at him feeling super embarrassed. Aruna backed off and started walking the other way, but Diaz shouted out to her. The girl got super flustered and bolted ahead, so Diaz took off right after her. He needed her to wait up so he wouldn't get left in the dust, and he was going to chase her down no matter how pitch black it got because he just knew Aruna would. Diaz and Eldon are hanging out in the carriage, and Eldon keeps it real. Growing their town is going to be a total struggle unless they stack up on way more food and supplies first. Eldon warns that if anything goes wrong, they'll run out of supplies instantly, and since winter is coming fast, they need to start prepping right now. Diaz agreed that starving wasn't the only nightmare they had to worry about. Diaz suddenly realized that if everyone was starving, Aruna and the kids were definitely going through the same thing. Diaz steps up and promises to hunt even harder so he can stock up on a ton of dried meat for the whole group. Eldon warns that eating the same boring food will totally ruin their health, so they've got to stock up on stuff like grain and vegetables too. Diaz looks out at the meadow and realizes it's time to get to work, asking the group if they're finally ready to start farming. Eldon asks Diaz if he's actually serious about farming this land, thinking it's going to be a total nightmare. He warns him that tons of people have tried to grow crops here before, and Diaz says he's not giving up no matter how long it takes, and tells them they need to go find out for themselves. Eldon says he totally gets it now and promises to back Diaz up with everything he's got to make sure he wins. Diaz finally snaps awake and his eyes fly open. He sneaks out of the tent super quietly so he doesn't wake the girls and goes for a big stretch. Diaz walks up to the well where Aruna is standing, and when he says hey, she totally blushes and greets him right back. The old ladies nearby grinned and noticed Aruna was in a great mood, asking if something awesome happened last night. Klaus rushes over to Diaz and tells him he spotted a super weird monster while he was out on his morning patrol. Klaus pulls out a bat and explains that a whole swarm was climbing nearby when one suddenly lunged at him, so he had to blast it out of the air to scare the others off. Diaz says they're bats, but he's never seen anything like him before, and Klaus is just as confused, so Diaz warns him to stay sharp and Klaus totally agrees. Diaz notices the sky is looking super clear today. The whole group decides to head outside to eat their breakfast together. While they're eating, Diaz checks in with everyone to see if they're feeling. Diaz guessed it was all thanks to Aruna's healing herbs. They were taking them every single day. They'd eat the herbs and even soak in medicinal baths to stay pure. Diaz turns to Aruna and asks where she's even finding all these healing herbs. She says she finds them nearby or trades for them, but she mostly just grows them herself. Dee asks if this means the tribe actually grows their own fields of healing herbs back at the village. Aruna explains they grow everything in pots so they can move fast, since they never know when they'll have to ditch this place and leave the fields behind. Diaz wants to start farming the meadow, thinking a big harvest will finally give them some peace, and he asks the guy if he's right about that. Diaz asks the girl to show him how to grow medicinal herbs in pots because he thinks she'd make a killer guide for the farm. But Aruna says she's actually clueless, and Diaz heads over to see the Oni chief, Shader Mogu, who tells him that farming in this place is a total lost cause. Shader has no idea why nothing will grow. Diaz tells Shader he's still totally down to learn how to grow those healing herbs. Shader says it's actually super simple, so he hands over a leaf fertilizer stone and promises that using it will make everything work out perfectly. This tin actually breaks down the whole secret process for making those healing herbs and seeds. Diaz looks at the stones and realizes he honestly can't tell if it's a cultural thing or just a difference in their values. The chief says their farm is a total bust, explaining that even the potatoes and beans they tried growing in pots just sprouted leaves before shriveling up and dying for good. It looks like the forest dwellers are hiding a massive secret, and Diaz is already asking questions about them. The boss says these forest people are total pros with plants, and he's heard they can turn a dead wasteland into a green paradise just by waving their hands, but he's never seen anything this all. The chief promises to go all in on the farming, but he wants Diaz to spill his secrets if it works, since making this land grow is their ultimate dream. Diaz pets the lamb with a grin and says he's totally down to spill the secret, since he always planned on sharing the trick anyway and even promises to bring a massive pile of potatoes. The chief just smirks, saying he totally saw this coming from Diaz Blue, and now the whole squad is rooting for him to win. The chief is hyped for Aruna and Diaz's new baby and says he'll hook them up with all the healing herbs they're gonna need. Diaz asks if they really have to do this, but the leader says it's way too important and promises to give Aruna the medicine. The leader starts talking Diaz into it because Diaz thinks the whole plan is super sketchy. Diaz heads back to Klaus, and the guy is right there to meet him. The girls spot them and sprint over, totally hyped that Diaz is back way sooner than expected. And as they welcome him, he gives a big smile and says he's finally home. He drops down right in front of the girls, and when they ask what's in his bag, he pops it open to show off a bunch of sparkling gems. He asks if they think the stones are beautiful, but the girls are totally unimpressed. The girls just act like they're totally normal and bored, saying they don't even want any of that special stuff anyway. A bunch of rams were standing right next to the girls. They all locked eyes for a second, and then the girls just bolted over to start playing with them. Aruna meets up with DS and asks what kind of rocks he's carrying, which totally catches him off guard since he thought they looked amazing. Arun reveals that if you look closely, these stones actually have zero magic. Then she realizes this guy can't sense magic at all. She knew that any mage could tell if a stone had power just by looking at it, and even though these looked like fancy jewels, they were totally empty and basically just regular rocks. Diaz is totally blown away by how much Aruna knows and wonders if Sanai and Ichin can spot the difference between stones too. But Aruna says those girls are actually super talented for their age and have enough hidden magic that, with the right training, they could even end up way stronger than the leader himself. Diaz grins at the girls, thinking about how they've got some seriously insane talent. He was looking at these kids thinking they were destined for an awesome future as legendary magicians no matter what. But then the girls suddenly screamed because someone was heading straight for them. They screamed for everyone to snap into action and get ready to fight back. A massive swarm of bats comes flying straight at the tribe. Diaz whips out his gun and tells Aruna and the kids to scramble into the yurt while they all charge ahead with Klaus. Klaus figured these morning bats were out for blood to get payback for their brother. They were way too tiny and there were just too many of them to handle. He realized his axe and spear weren't yawned. Diaz jumped right into the action and started taking out those bats. Klaus jumped in to help, and the two of them spent forever swinging their weapons until every single bat was wiped out. One bat zooms right at Diaz and snatches the axe with its teeth, making him realize he's finally facing the leader of the pack. Klaus rushed straight at Diaz and decked the pack boss. Then they went right back to fighting off the bats. Those bats were moving crazy fast as Klaus and Eruna yelled for Diaz to stay in the fight. He swung his axe with zero hesitation and landed a massive hit on the pack boss. Eruna explains that these mecha kushi bots are super sensitive to noise, so they'll have to crank up their voices to win. Diaz just smiles and tells Eruna she totally saved there. He admits the screen totally freaked him out. Eruna apologizes for being sloppy since the big ones usually stay away, and then Diaz starts asking all about these monsters. The girl just stares at him in total silence, so Dia flashes a grin and apologizes, saying his hearing is still pretty messed up. Eruna smirks and leans in to whisper something secret, leaving Diaz looking totally shocked. The guy tried calling Runa to ask her what she said, but Klaus was already face down on the ground, totally out cold. Diaz smashes the stones and reaches into the bowl to see if he actually turned them into dust. Diaz leans back with a huge grin because he's finally finished. After 5 long days of grinding those fertilizer stones from the chief, the hard part is over and they can finally start farming the fields. Diaz knew his first job was to clear the field and plow the land, but then Eruna suddenly called out to him. Diaz whipped around as the girl shouted that someone was closing in from the east. Diaz and Eruna headed toward the visitors, but Diaz was stuck thinking about Aruna's warning. She sensed a huge group of riders, plus something else that definitely wasn't a... Diaz was about to go check things out, but Eruna refused to let him go alone until she knew exactly who was heading their way. Diaz felt way more chill having Eruna along for the ride, and as she shouted that they'd see the newcomers any second, he whipped out his binoculars to get a better look. His eyes go wide as he realizes it's Camelos, and he quickly tells Eruna that Eldon's servant is headed right for them. She tells the guy to stop hyping it up if he really knows him. Diaz spins around to see what's creeping up on him. He spots these weird white animals standing there. Then it hits him. They're actually buffalo. He sees a whole crowd of people, and Diaz recognizes the white beast that looks just like a black buffalo and thinks the name is a total win since it's so easy to remember. Eruna takes a super close look at the carts. Then she mentions seeing a tiny shadow moving around in the second cart's bags. She thinks this little creature is actually spying on everyone. Diaz. Right now, a bunch of tiny mice are bouncing all over the cart. The one wearing glasses is replaying the moment they got busted while out hunting. They managed to sneak inside just as this mouse with glasses was just trying to snag some beans, but when another mouse asked what she was up to, she practically jumped out of her skin. The mouse with glasses decides to grab some snacks, but the other mouse warns her it'll only slow them down. The mouse with glasses nervously asks how they're going to survive such a long trip without any food. They have no idea when they'll even get a chance to hop off the cart and find something to... Mouse asks Ima if she seriously hasn't noticed they're heading west instead of south to the desert, adding that since Ima's actually smart, she should have guessed their real plan is to take down Diaz. Mouse declares they're going to take down Diaz to show off their true power and finally bring some respect back to the desert people. Ima's totally stunned because she only used her genius brain to help everyone just so she could get back to the desert. She followed orders and came up with a perfect plan to sneak. Ima points out that since this guy took down the dragon, he's way stronger than it, and she manages to convince everyone that they don't stand a chance against Diaz. They all started bragging about being a powerful desert clan and began trashing humans, convinced that taking out Diaz was the right move. The mice trick Ima into thinking they're the ones in charge, and they still remember the guy who ordered them to bring food back to the desert. The card stops dead, making me look like a total fraud, and now Diaz is heading straight for it. He greets them right away and thanks them for showing up. Kamalis tells them that Eldon's delivery has finally arrived. Hearing this, all the mice get super ticked off. DS is hyped that Kamalos finally showed up, and while he's apologizing for the rush to ask a question, one of the mice tries to bail from the cart, but Ima stops it because Ima shoves the mouse away and wipes out, just as Diaz hears a weird noise coming from the bags and asks if something is hiding in there. Suddenly, mice leap out of the cart to jump Diaz, thinking he's an easy target, but he's totally blown away when they actually start talking. Eruna whips out her weapon and sends every single mouse running for their lives. Diaz is totally shocked when she calls him out for being reckless, but as he asks if she's talking about his skills, Arunas warns them that they can't just take it since it might belong to Kamalos. The mice start swarming Diaz again while talking trash about Eruna, but he shoves his axe forward and shouts that she's an amazing girl, swearing he won't let them get... Kamalos demands to know why there are mice in the cart, loses it when they start talking, and orders his men to hunt them all down. Every single mouse was actually a cotton bag, and they were all scrambling to escape while screaming insults at the entire human race. Camilo bowed deep to apologize to Diaz and wanted to make it official, but Diaz told him he didn't need to say sorry at all. Camilo claims the mice are actually a tribe living on their own land and refuses to leave without apologizing, which totally shocks Diaz as he realizes they're basically just like beastmen. Kamalos broke down how the beastmen are different, explaining that they actually have their own culture and can totally talk. Diaz remembers an old legend from when he was a kid, and a message from God that makes him realize the Maister are actually human too. Kamalis explains that these little guys are actually a tribe of long-eared jumping mice who call the desert their home. DS is totally caught off guard by the massive desert in Elden's land, especially since he's never even heard of a kingdom made of sand before. Kamalots keeps going, explaining how Mage calls the desert their home, and even reveals exactly where they're hiding. Diaz gets totally serious once he thinks they've run into a slave hunter, while the mice keep diving into the bags and screaming their heads off. DS thought Elden promised to give them back the desert, but they didn't trust him at all, even though he was a total legend who did everything to keep his clan safe. Kamalas explains that once Elden became a lord, he swore he'd give the mice their home back. Aruna points out that Camelot used to be white but turned blue, so she thinks they should just let him off the hook without making him pay a thing. Suddenly, she remembers the mice were bright red and warns that next time, they won't be playing nice at all. Kamalos stares Diaz down, but Diaz just smirks and says he doesn't need to apologize for what happened, though he'll still take it even if Kamalos is being stubborn. Diaz says these mice are straight up losing it, and he's pretty sure they won't be holding back next time. He figures he'll just give the mice a warning and let Camelots handle the real punishment. So Camelots grins and follows orders while Aruna and DS both share a smile. A beastman walks up to Camelots and to say the inspection is done, but he admits his nose is failing him because the cargo is so packed with spice that the smell is everywhere. Camelot nods like he's got the whole plan down. He heads over to start digging through the cargo. He checks every single cart himself to make sure nothing is hidden. But even after all that, they drag those mice back to Elden to grill them about why they jumped Diaz, and then give them the punishment they had coming. Diaz turned to Camelot and started asking him all about the spices and the best way to move their household tools. Kamalo says it was way too loud to tell Diaz earlier, but since the gear is all set, he hands over an envelope and tells him to check out the spices. The letter said Elden would hook him up with more tools if he ran out, and he really hoped Diaz liked the spices he sent. Elden finally wraps things up by talking about their future trade deals and their last meeting, wishing them luck and saying he's hyped for the next time they link up. The letter said all this stuff was a gift to prove their friendship, so Diaz didn't have to pay a single cent. Kamalis walks up to Diaz and tells him Elden finally sent over the building supplies for the stables, leaving Diaz totally shocked. The servants standing behind Kamalos told Diaz to chill out, since they were only there to help with the construction. Diaz was starting to stress because he'd taken so much stuff without giving a single thing back. Kamalos asks Diaz if he wants to take the reins, pointing out that the whole horse cart is officially his now, while Aruna just stares at the horses looking totally blown away. Kamala keeps hyping up the horses, saying that if the coachman shows him the ropes, Diaz will be able to handle them in no time. Aruna walks right up to Diaz and asks if all of this is actually for real, and he tells her straight up that it is. The guy doesn't even get a chance to speak because Aruna is already racing toward the horses, super stoked that they're finally theirs. Diaz had no clue that horses were the tribe's main way of getting around. The guy said having a ton of horses showed you were rich and brave, but Aaron's family was way too broke for that. ES looked at the girl and wondered if Aruna had ever spent a single moment not stressing over her family. Aruna spins around and admits she's always dreamed of being a horse-riding tribe girl, and since Diaz made it happen way faster than she expected, she just tackles him with a massive hug before he can even open his mouth. She thanked Diaz and said she'd handle the horses, but even when he asked if Aruna was finally chill, she just kept hugging him tight. Ema sat huddled in the cart thinking it was game over, and they'd definitely find her, so the little mouse tried to make a run for it, but she was totally trapped by something blocking her way. The mouse is literally begging for anyone to come and save her. The victim's sister rushes over and asks to see the tea leaves, promising they can check them out together. The girl realizes the seeds in the tea are the exact same thing. Her sister totally agrees, and it hits them both that their parents were obsessed with tea too. True Cheese's grandma warns Diaz to hold the reins tight, but he says Buffalo is already a pro at farm work, so she just nods and keeps moving forward. The guy gets to work with the plow and is totally blown away by how fast he's tearing through the field. After grinding for a few hours, Diaz finally decided to take a breather. Chiruchi told him they should just leave the land alone for a bit. She suggested they wait 3 whole days before getting back to. Chiruchi wants to see if anything will finally grow in the field, And in the meantime, she tells them to start digging a massive water tank. Diaz asks about the reservoir, and Grandma gives him the full rundown on how the village's water system actually works. Grandma asks Diaz if he's figured out the reservoir yet, and when he says he's going to build one, she gives him some major props. The girls rush over to ask Diaz if he's done plowing the fields, but he tells them he's still busy and wonders what they actually want. The girls hesitated for a second, but then they told the guy he had to head back since Aruna was already busy making dinner. Diaz is super stoked and thanks the girls for the invite, but then he notices they suddenly look totally bummed out. He scoops the girls up to see if they're okay, and they immediately ask if Diaz is struggling to plow the field. He says it's no big deal, and when one of the girls asks if Diaz will be mad if the field fails, he says he'll be totally chill about it. She looks up at Diaz with sad eyes and asks if he'd be mad if he found out they were keeping a secret from him. He stares at her for a second and tells her there's no way he'd get mad, because let's be real, everyone's got their own little secrets. The girl gives a shaky smile and Diaz is left wondering what the heck just happened. The girls hit the ground and bolt for it, leaving the guy standing there totally confused about what just happened. The guy was totally stressed and kept bugging the girls to spill the secret, but they didn't give him a single answer. Arona was totally clueless about the girl's secret, and even though the whole village was begging for answers, they wouldn't say a single word. Diaz was totally stressing out wondering what went down, but even after watching them like a hawk, he didn't see anything suspicious at all. He figured kids that age are just naturally weird, so he decided to totally brush it off and move on. Aruna told him 3 days were up and it was finally time to plant, so she handed over the seeds and explained exactly what they could do. She figured these seeds were just a test to see if the field would actually work, and the guy gave her a quick thanks. Diaz was super hyped because he knew that fertilizer would make the seeds sprout in no time, and he couldn't wait to see it happen. Klaus caught up with Diaz to let him know that Kamalos's crew finally finished building the stable. Diaz was totally blown away that Kamalos and his crew finished building that stable so fast. Diaz found out the stables were built super fast using pre-made parts that just snapped together, making the whole job a total breeze. Diaz thanks Kamilos, and the guy says he was just doing exactly what Eldon told him to. S says this stuff isn't just a payment, it's a gift straight from the heart, and he points to the side telling Kamalos he's got to take it. Kamalos asks what the gear is made of, and when Diaz reveals it's actually Earth Dragon parts, everyone totally freaks out, but Kamalos says he can't possibly take a gift that insane. A servant asks what Diaz is really up to, but he just smirks and apologizes. So Kamalos and his crew treat the gifts like they're just holding on to them until the legal paperwork gets signed. The next morning, Kamalos announced it was finally time to head out. Diaz made sure to thank the guy for all his help. Aruna just watched from the side while the upset girls huddled around her. Diaz remembers how shy the girls were at first, but since they finally got used to Kamalos, it makes sense why they're so upset now. Aruna tells the girls to dry their eyes because they've still got horses to look after later. Arun tells the girls to move it, or the horses are going to start crying from being so hungry and thirsty. Diaz takes a good look at the field and realizes something is totally wrong when he sees all the little sprouts have already shriveled up. Aruna walks right up to Diaz, who just smirks and admits he never thought they'd actually pull it off, so he offers to start the whole process over again. The very next day, the new crops shriveled up too, so Aruna went right back to find that man. He looked back and figured there wasn't enough fertilizer, so he decided to toss in a little extra. The next morning, the guy dumped a ton of fertilizer on the dirt, but still nothing grew, so Aruna walked back up to it. Diaz realized he was low on fertilizer again, so he decided to totally crank up the amount. The guy kept doing the same thing over and over, but the crops still wouldn't grow, and when Aruna tried to help him out again, Diaz just made a face and stood up. Diaz was still thinking about dumping in even more rock fertilizer, but Aruna suddenly grabbed his hand and begged him to quit so he could finally get some rest. Aruna says there's no way you can mix that much rock fertilizer with leaves, and she's dead sure that farming in these meadows is just impossible. Diaz agrees that some seeds just never sprout, so he decides to move on and focus on other stuff instead. Diaz and Runa head back home while the girls watch them leave, totally unsure of what to do next, but it's obvious she really wants to help him out. She's totally lost and has no clue what to do, but right then she pulls out a tiny glass jar. Out of nowhere, the girls hear a weird noise, and after asking the sister if she heard someone screaming for help, they decide to go find out what's going on. Right now, Ima is trapped in a hut screaming for help, and after a whole week without any water, she's reaching her absolute limit. Ima's totally regretting not asking Diaz for help with that box, and the second the girls walk into the hut, they scare the life out of a tiny mouse. The girls shout out to see if anyone's in there, and Ima immediately screams for help. This confirms exactly what they were thinking, and Ima tells them she's stuck. Ima checks if they're all right, thinking the girls are trying to rescue her, but he tells them to stop playing hero and just go find some adults. The girls tell him all the adults are way too busy to help. Ima begs him to just listen to what she has to say. He says he's totally fine with waiting a little. The mouse screams that the girl saved his life, thanking them and saying he barely survived the struggle. The girls are super hyped to see the mouse and immediately start introducing themselves. The girls start hyping Amy up, and the little mouse even gives them a big thank you. Ima introduces herself right back and tells everyone exactly where she's from. Arunas catches Diaz still working the field and tells him to quit it. She demands he stop right now. He's sure he's finally going to win this time. She screams that he looks like a... The girls were totally confused why Ama was locked in that box, figuring he must have done something bad to get punished like that. She screams that she's totally innocent and starts explaining exactly how she ended up inside that box. The girls ask Ima what she thinks of Diaz, but she admits she's never even talked to him and they aren't friends, leaving the group trading some majorly suspicious looks. They decide to go talk to Ima and tell her they've been keeping a massive secret. Ima demanded to know what secret the girls were keeping. She figured there had to be someone else way better for the job, but the girl told her that literally nobody in the village was actually a good... The girls are gossiping about how Diaz grinds in the fields every single day, but absolutely nothing is going his way. The girls say the earth is totally out of juice, so Diaz's moves won't work. And even though they can fix the world's glitches, they can't do it for. The girls suddenly remember their parents' warnings about their crazy forest-shaping abilities. They knew that if word got out, people would definitely try to use this power for the wrong reasons. The girls were desperate to help Diaz out. Since Ama wasn't even human, they knew they could trust her with all their secrets. They asked her what their next move should be. Ima tells the girls to hold on for a second and asks them what race they're supposed to be. The girls reveal they're actually forest dwellers who spend their days guarding and studying the woods. Ima starts thinking back to everything she knows about the forest people, remembering that they actually pack all their strength and knowledge into a seed right before they die. The girls talk about planting seeds in super important places. Right before they die, the forest people give their seed to someone they love so it can grow into a forest. The person who gets the seed takes... I could tell the girls had two insane powers, like making trees and grass grow super fast and creating massive shields. And the mouse finally realized they needed these gifts to keep the forest safe. Ima asks if she's still good enough to be an assistant, and the girls tell her she's definitely staying because she's a total genius. Ima realized the girls were still too young to make a whole forest, but they could still wrap the woods in a small shield. She knew that if they kept going, the trees would start growing like... The mouse just couldn't wrap her head around why these girls were living with a guy like Diaz. To her, it was way better to just stay far away from people altogether. The girls swear Diaz is the nicest guy around, way kinder than anyone else in the whole village. So they're actually thinking about letting him in on the big secret. They're betting on the fact that he won't go crazy with all that power. Ima totally gets... The girls realize this spot is literally sucking up all the Earth's energy, so they break down how it works, while Ama insists they figure out what's really going on to find a way. The girls just shake their heads and claim they have absolutely no clue. The girls realize the kid isn't actually evil, but they're still freaked out by how bad this stretching thing could get. Ima starts to figure out what. Mouse asks if they can just use their powers on the low, but the girls say Diaz is always watching them, so then he suggests sneaking out at night, but they admit they're such heavy sleepers they'd never even wake up. The mouse offers to wake them up since he has perfect night vision, and he says he can get them home if they just tell him where they live. The girls are super relieved they finally talked things out, and Ima realizes that taking the time to listen was totally worth it. Ima tells the girls to chill out and pick a plan right now before they get busted. The girls just couldn't stop, and Ama was seriously starting to get a bad feeling about this. Once night falls, Yima tracks down the girls' hut and sneaks inside through a hole in the wall. The mouse spots Diaz and totally panics. Then he lets out a sneeze, but Diaz doesn't even budge, and the little guy realizes that was a super close call. The mouse finds the twins and tries to wake them up for the field, but the girls just open their eyes for a second before falling right back asleep. The girls finally wake up and head outside, but Ima can tell they're totally freaked out and asks what's wrong, so they admit they're freezing and scared out of their minds. Mouse wonders how they even use the bathroom in the dark, and the girls reveal that Diaz and Aruna always went with them to keep them safe. The girl steps forward and pulls out her parents' seeds. The girls grin and say their parents' seeds give them strength, so they never go anywhere without them. and Aim finally gets the picture. They finally reach the field and told the mouse to hang back while Emma stared at the massive zone Diaz had built. The girls whipped out the seeds and faced off, immediately starting to chant their spells. They watched the seeds float up and start to sparkle, leaving Emma totally shocked. The girls shared a hyped look and kept firing off spells as a massive glow suddenly wrapped around them. Then he just vanished again. And while the girls kept firing off magic, Emma was just trying to make sense of what they were saying. The girls say the barrier is totally solid, but then they start rubbing their eyes and saying they're ready to crash. The mouse asks if the barrier is finished, and seeing the girls head home totally exhausted, she realizes her job is finally over. The girls headed back to bed and passed out instantly. They were even mumbling random stuff in their sleep. The mouse was just lying there right between them. She was begging them to let her go. Morning hits the city of Melangal, and inside a tavern in the Kazdex territory, some serious talk is already going down. The whole town was buzzing about Eldon heading to the royal capital, and they couldn't believe he actually took the magic stone with him. A visitor claims this magic stone will give him happy memories, and he's sure it'll make the whole Kazdex region way more peaceful. This other guy says humans almost never hang out with half-humans, so he's sure Eldon is plotting something shady. Word got around the tavern that the Dragon Slayer actually had a demi-human wife, and apparently, the two of them were totally in love. Everyone was gossiping about how he came from the east. The guests gossiped about how the Dragon Slayer's wife was the first human he ever ran into, figuring Diaz fell so hard for her that he started loving other half-humans too, and one guest says the Dragon Slayer and Eldon are only friends because of the Slayer's wife, so the half-beast asks what race she is, but the only thing anyone knows is that this beast-man visitor thinks she's a rhino and is convinced that humans have totally fallen for the rhino race. This deer-looking guy asks his friends if they've spotted the sign the Dragon Slayer put up to find new neighbors. One of the visitors recognizes the sign and remembers exactly what it said, mentioning that a bunch of dog people were actually super into it. They start talking about the long-eared jumping mice attack, and he reveals it was all planned by a mastermind who actually egged the mice on to strike. Nobody had ever heard of this race of 8 men before, so everyone figured it was a total scam and that these guys were just making the whole thing up. One customer says it was a tall guy with a black cloth over his face, and while the whole tavern wonders how the mice could trust someone so sketchy, they suddenly spot that exact same dude. This guy in the black cloak has no clue what the beastmen are saying, and even though he thinks they're just total idiots he can easily trick, they won't even listen to him no matter how much gold he flashes. This sketchy guy only managed to trick a bunch of mice, but he didn't care about them anyway since he was still going after Diaz. 2 knights were gossiping about everyone ditching Diana's squad, and they could tell her whole faction was about to crumble. One of them heard that the Maze group just lost Duke Cass. The knights started talking about who was actually on Richard and Isabella's side, and they were dying to uncover the real truth about the royal family's secret bloodline. The knights are totally on edge because everything is about to change, especially since they just found out the king's second son is actually tight with Diaz and is bragging about their friendship. The knight just got word that DS is the new lord of Neutros Meadows. The second knight heard some crazy rumors about those lands too. He's actually really into the story of the... Suddenly, the commander rushes over to tell the knights that Diana just took off with a massive army past the capital, but the knights are just confused why everyone is freaking out over something so normal. The commander just reported that Diana took a massive army and a ton of wagons with her, and he's sure the war is finally kicking off again. The knight said they could just ignore it because someone else was going to handle the problem anyway. Aruna opens her eyes and sees the girls looking totally decked out in their fancy outfits. She leans in for a closer look and spots a tiny mouse actually wishing her a good morning. Arunus lets out a terrified scream that snaps DS wide awake. The morning was already a total mess with crazy stuff happening left and right. You could definitely feel that something was seriously wrong. It turns out the twins actually spent the whole night sleeping with a mouse. Jalant flies right toward Diaz, and that's when the guy finally realizes what was behind those terrifying screams he heard earlier. He was freaking out about another attack, but since Emo was bright blue, Aruna told him he had nothing to worry about. Jolant tilts her head and asks about the color, but DS just tells her to totally forget about it. The seeds he planted that evening sprouted way too fast, and just when DS thought it was normal, he spotted a perfect circle right in the middle of the field. He also noticed the stuff mixed into his soil was totally different from his grandma's field, and he had no clue why. Jalant cracks up and says the story is totally wild, but then he points out some super loud birds flying over the field. Diaz asks Jolant if she can actually talk to birds, but she just laughs and says there's no way she can do that, leaving him looking totally annoyed. Diaz flashes back to the third time the twins totally trashed the warehouse, and even though he finished cleaning, he was still freaking out over some beans that spilled out of a chest until Jalant just laughed. Diaz realized that a bird stopping by was actually the biggest thing to happen to him all day. He remembers grabbing those beans and bumping into Jalant from the pigeon people, and he was totally freaked out when Jalant asked why everyone was making so much noise. Jalant suddenly remembers his job. He was supposed to deliver Eldon's letter and get Diaz to confirm. Diaz is totally lost on what Jalant means at first. He heads down and rips open the bag. Inside, he finds 3 different letters. The first one is a straight-up apology. The second, Diaz looks up and asks Jalant what little species even means, since he's totally clueless about it. Jalant explains that there are big and small dog people, but the little ones are so incredibly clumsy that they have a really hard time getting any work done. Diaz thinks about rocking this new style and heads off to ask his friends, but he stops when he sees Jolan eyeing the beans like a hungry beast and tells him the pigeon can just eat them. Diaz walks up to Klaus to see what he thinks about dog people, and since Klaus is totally cool with it, the rest of the crew is down too. Diaz went to check in with Aruna, but she was still busy chewing out the girls for that mouse in the bed. The girls were totally hyped the second they heard the news. Aruna says the vibe is way too crazy to keep teaching, and Diaz asks if the girls have spilled anything yet. Aruna says the girls are dwelling on what they did, but the twins are keeping totally quiet about it anyway. Diaz thinks they're definitely hiding something, but he's sure they aren't actually bad guys, so he tells everyone to just wait. And Aruna smiles because Diaz spots a mouse lurking behind the girls, and it instantly reminds him of Arun's soul assessment, making him wonder how they could ever be friends with a creature like that. Diaz drops to one knee and asks, "I'm a how he ended up here, but Mouse says the whole story is going to take a while." Diaz zips up the bag and lets it go, sending Jolant zooming off into the distance. He took off into the sky carrying a letter Diaz wrote. He's only got 24 hours to get it where it needs to go. Inside, Diaz spilled all the tea about. Ima perched on Diaz's shoulder and told him she was really counting on him now, and Diaz just grinned, super happy that she was actually staying in the village with them. Ima spilled everything she knew. After finishing her story, she decided to make Iluk village her new home. Diaz asked her why she chose that place. Ima said she just wanted to. Ima told him she could totally read and write. She even offered to teach the other girls, and she begged him to let her stay because she absolutely refused to back down. Diaz introduced Ima to the whole crew to see what they thought, and while everyone else was cool with it, Aruna was definitely not vibing. The mouse begged Aruna to let her blend in with the rest, and after setting some ground rules, Ima finally became an official member of Iluk village. The guy scanned the warehouse and realized some bags were missing, but he was really hunting for a specific barrel of wine. Ima heard that wine barrel was actually for a welcome party, so she says they should go check it out right now. Diaz steps out of the warehouse and spots the wine barrel already sitting in the hall for the big welcome party. Ima asks the grandmas what they're up to. Diaz figures they're making something sweet, and then the mouse suddenly screams and leaps off his shoulder to beg for a taste. Diaz was totally clueless about why everyone was suddenly getting ready for the holiday, but Aruna saw him looking lost and walked right up to him. She asks if he's shocked, and he totally is, wondering how they even found the time to set all this up. The girl plays it off like Diaz was just busy, smiling as she says they started getting ready while he was writing a letter, and then she and Diaz just lock eyes. She calls out Diaz for hiding the wine without asking her first, making Aruna wonder if that was even allowed since the kingdom has strict laws. But Diaz was really just worried about everyone getting addicted. He didn't know the village laws, but since Aruna just turned 15, he got worried about her and stashed the wine away. Aruna just smiles and says she's not even mad since Diaz did it all for her, plus she's actually known what was going on for a long time. She looks him right in the eye and says it was just a little payback, reminding Diaz that since they're married, he needs to start talking to her. Aruna blushes hard and admits she gets really sad during times like this, so she begs Diaz to finally tell her everything. Aruna reminds him they're literally married and should talk about themselves, so Diaz says sorry and then just starts geeking out over wine. She gives him a terrifying look and shuts him down, making him think he's talking crazy and that wine is actually super healthy. Aruna explains all about horse milk wine and how families give it to kids who just stopped nursing. Diaz is completely losing it, yelling that giving wine to a baby is just straight up messed up. Aruna snaps and calls out their lies, finally revealing the truth about what she actually went through. The grandma gives Diaz a quick smack on the back, and the guy asks what's going on. Grandma says Diaz and Aruna are totally vibing, so she tells them to help get the party ready. He tried to make excuses, but His grandma cut him off to say they found a barrel of wine and it was time to party. Diaz was totally shook that Aruna was stressing over the wine running out right after a dogman showed up, and he figured she was officially a lost cause. Diaz smiles at her, realizing this was Aruna's real plan all along, and since he felt just as guilty for keeping her in the dark, he decided to just keep his mouth shut. Tons of new tribes were constantly flooding into Iluk, so the Aztec made his own rules to keep everyone from starting a riot. Diaz knew being the Lord meant he had to step up and protect his village from anyone looking for trouble. The party finally ended the next day, but breakfast featured a super weird liquid the girl called cummies. And since she couldn't stop thinking about what Diaz said about alcohol, she took the new. Diaz wonders how she can drink this early, but she dares him to try it, and one sip of that kumis leaves him totally stunned. He asks if it's actually booze, but Grandma says he'd have to drink a ton of it to even feel a buzz. Diaz realized the drink was super weak, so he figured it was totally fine to give the kid a little taste. Adruna starts hyping up how great kumis is, and Diaz realizes she thinks it's a strong drink, but since he's used to way harder stuff, they're definitely not. Diaz realized they had to talk things out since everyone had their own history and their own way of doing things. Diaz noticed the vibe spreading through the whole village, and suddenly, everyone started talking to each other way more. While Diaz and his grandma were busy planting, the twins came sprinting up to show off a massive haul of yamoshi, and Diaz gave them a huge thanks for the help. The girls all raised their hands to start farming the field, and the guy was totally cool with letting them do it. Diaz grins and says he's going to start a little farm next, but since it's too dangerous far away, he'll set it up right by the horses, and the girls are super thankful. Diaz turns around to thank the grandmas for their hard work, and they thank him right back. The guy stops to see Grandma Celia because she's got something she needs to tell him. That evening, everyone met up to discuss Grandma Celia's big idea, and she straight up said they didn't need to check with the rest of the village at all. She thinks everyone is just mindlessly following Diaz and warns that they need a real plan for when the group starts clashing. Grandma suggested picking a few reps to gather everyone's thoughts and tell Diaz, but they had to be brave enough to speak up. So everyone agreed and kept the meeting moving. The whole squad sat down and broke down every single detail of the rules. Diaz was the one who actually made the final call. Aruna started giving out pointers on how to keep the house in order. Grandma Maya steps up to speak for her whole group. Klaus is the big boss in charge of the army, and the reps have to gather everyone's ideas so they can speak up at the meetings. Ima's got the brains, so she decided to step up and represent the Beastmen group. Diaz and the whole village agreed to play by the rules, so now the dog people had to step up and pick their own leader. They stayed up way past midnight until they finally locked in some massive plans. Aruna shook Diaz awake to tell him they had company, but he just wanted to know why they were showing up so early. She was totally knocked out and didn't even notice the visitors until they were right at the village, but she promised to spill all the details while they're on the move. She figured they were dog people and saw a whole bunch of them in all different sizes. He's already figured out who it is while she's still totally clueless, but just as she's about to say something, she screams because someone is standing right in their path. Aruna and Diaz were totally shocked to see a massive anaconda lunging at the dog people while they were trying to make a run for it. The anaconda opened its massive mouth, leaving Diaz shouting for answers while Aruna was still just trying to process what was even happening. The girl screams that it's an anaconda, but Diaz is totally confused since he didn't know they brought a monster, and she warns him that the beast is literally hunting them down. Arunar realizes she totally forgot her bow and arrows at home, and right as the giant anaconda lunges for its prey, Diaz and the crew can only watch in pure terror. She snatches one of the dog guys while they're all screaming for help, and the man charges right into the fight. Aruna screamed for him to stop, totally panicking because they didn't have any weapons to fight back. The anaconda lunged at Diaz-Will with its jaws wide open, but he just smashed the snake right back, and the deviation lunged forward, trying to snatch her up. The snake started thrashing around, but Diaz just gripped it even tighter and totally took it down. Aruna sprints over and calls him out for being way too reckless, but the guy just says he's sorry. The dog squad rushes the giant anaconda and shouts into its mouth to check on their friend. And when one of them actually crawls out alive, the whole crew starts celebrating. Aruna is totally freaking out because she forgot her bow and arrows, and she swears she'll never let it happen again. One thanks Diaz for the help, fills him in on the drama, and then asks for names so Diaz and Aruna can finally introduce themselves. The girl introduces herself as Canis, and explains that Eldon put her in charge of leading and protecting a group of tiny creatures. Canis reveals who's on the list to be moved and points her finger right at Blackford, T. Bay Musty. Then she starts talking about the brown-haired Basenji and finally brings up the black-haired Osun Shipu. Kenna explains that clan names are a massive deal, while Aruno is busy getting his soul checked out, so she heads over to Diaz to tell him the test is done and spills everything she saw. Canis remembers the little guys were looking for jobs, so she asks Diaz if he can hook them up with some work. The dog people stare at Diaz with pleading eyes, and he starts telling them exactly where they need more help. EAS told the dog people they could finally start working and promised to hook them up with any job they want. The dog people start jumping around like crazy. He tells them to chill out for a second. Right away, the whole pack does exactly what he says. Diaz definitely catches on to what's going on. Diaz leans in while Aruna just keeps staring. And with Keeney's looking totally shocked, Diaz introduces himself again and says he's super stoked to meet them. Canis was shocked to be talking eye to eye with these human dogs, making her realize just how weird Diaz really was. The dogs all get in a line and start introducing themselves. The Mastai clan chief introduces himself and holds out a paw, so Diaz shakes it and tells him it's great to meet him. The clan leader, Sidoreo Bar Senji, steps up to introduce himself and explains how they're going to help the village, while Diaz shakes his paw and mentions who else is ready to back them up. Diaz spins around and sees another dogman rushing up to introduce himself as the chief of the Rai Hato Goda Funyada Sef Osunshepu clan. And when he offers to look after the horses, Diaz is actually pretty stoked. Aruna and Diaz share a grin as the guy finally agrees, saying he's down to trust them with the horses and sheep. Diaz looks over and sees Aruna already greeting the crowd and introducing herself to everyone. The dog people were totally doubting if Aruna was actually Diaz's wife since she looked so young and gorgeous, but she just flashed them a smile. The leaders from every valve gave their updates while making sure to welcome the massive crowd of guests. Kinese looks over at Diaz and asks if he's actually for real about turning these little guys into soldiers. She insisted they stick to the easy stuff since they were way too weak for the heavy lifting. Diaz remembers hearing about this before, and he can tell Canis is totally freaking out. Diaz, Canis, and Aruna walk up to Klaus, where Diaz thanks him for the patrol, and Klaus says thanks back before asking who the new faces are. Diaz introduces the guests. Klaus says what's up to Canis, and the girl says hey to the guy too. They stared at each other in total awe, but suddenly, they both felt something super weird happen. Aruna caught on instantly, but DS was still standing there looking totally clueless. The dog people asked the grandmothers what the plan was, and a few of them tagged along with Sinai and Aiken to go grab some stones. Diaz realized these stones worked just like superpowered fertilizer, helping the plants grow massive roots and sprout like crazy. Diaz watched the dog people working hard by the well, thinking about how it's already been 10 whole days since they first showed up. Diaz figured their parents taught them how to handle stones, and the girls immediately got to work out in the fields. DS whipped around at the noise and saw a bunch of dog people looking super hyped as they headed off to work. Diaz realized the dog people's clumsiness wasn't actually a big deal, so he just whipped up some custom gear to help them out. Cloud screamed for the squad to get over to him right now. A pack of dog people quickly closed in and trapped the guy. Canis and Diaz just stood there and watched the whole thing. The whole pack of dog people charged forward and started jumping Klaus. Diaz stood there stunned as they pinned Klaus to the ground and started licking him like crazy. Klaus had lost yet again. He just bragged that they were getting faster and more efficient every single day. Diaz knew Klaus was a total war veteran who had survived the front lines. He'd even taken down high-ranking generals, earning him the scary nickname Klaus the Decapitator. Diaz noticed Canis was stressed out, and that totally started to freak him out too. He skipped the boring talk about their territory duties and decided to just show them exactly what he meant in action. Regular war dogs were a total mess, so he decided that human dogs would be way more effective. Since it was just some basic robbers hitting the plains, Diaz realized the dog people wouldn't have to deal with any super dangerous enemies. The crew was hanging out in the tomb of the first king of Sansa Reef. They were busy checking out all the crazy jewels they found. Princess Diana told them they better not touch the pain. She smirked at the statues, snatched up the scepter, and couldn't stop grinning. Just then, a girl asked what she was going to do with that scepter, and Diana just smirked, saying she was definitely putting it to use. She starts telling the epic legend of the kings who started it all. Diana thinks they should take out Diaz first, then build a massive army to conquer the whole country. Diana tells the girl to chill because she's got everything under control. She reveals that she's actually got a secret plan ready to go. The girl is totally shocked by the news. Diana flashes the royal seal, and the lady totally snaps, screaming that after Diaz ended the war, he actually had the nerve to reject her offer. She'd heard Diaz was a total savage to everyone and was convinced his whole reputation was just a big lie. She was hunting for justice, but her teammate thought Diana was totally losing it, so she knew she had to go tell Richard everything. One line out. Rule 2. No line breaks. Rule 7. Just output the rewritten text directly in a single line. Okay, I will provide one. This was his big shot. He was finally going to take down Diana and Diaz. He wanted payback on every single person who ever messed with him. He was going to become the country's greatest hero. That night, Prince Richard finally showed up at the royal hall, but he was totally hiding behind Diana the whole time. Everyone was totally convinced that Richard was the one who raided the royal tomb, but they figured they didn't even need to get involved. Richard sits down and says there's no way they can play nice with the enemy because they might run right into Diaz. The group asked how this even related to the last order, but Richard just blamed Aziz and said Diana was taking a massive risk. Richard started rattling off every single nickname Diaz had ever been called. He also brings up that big rule from the war and how Diaz was actually being a really nice guy. Richard says some of Diaz's nicknames are actually totally wrong. He tells this story about Diaz hearing weird noises in a barn and sprinting over to check it out. When he gets inside, the guy lets the girl go and ties the boys up, and when one kid starts whining, Diaz just grins and hits him. Since the guy was a high-ranking noble, Diaz was hauled off to the royal court, but he stood his ground until the king backed him up completely, forcing everyone else to agree and ending. Richard warns everyone that Diaz doesn't care about your rank and will take down anyone, so you'd better not mess with him. One noble thinks Diaz is too chicken to even touch the king, but Richard speaks up and says this isn't the first time it's happened, so everyone goes totally quiet as he starts spilling. A guy walks up to Richard with a question on his mind, asking why the king actually kicked Diaz out to the border. Richard is totally over this guy's attitude and tells him he's dead wrong because his dad never actually kicked him out. Richard says the king put Diaz in charge of the plane because he needed someone he could actually count on. And after hearing how much his dad respected the guy, the man asks if that's for real. Diaz breaks down the country's mess and why he's the only one they can trust, explaining that his dad had a perfect team and all the gear ready until Misa's crew showed up and ruined everything. The girl walks right up to Richard and asks him point blank, which member of the royal family did DS actually hurt? The whole room goes dead quiet as Richard looks super annoyed. His guards let out a massive sigh, and the girl is totally shocked when a servant suddenly walks right up to her. The servant tells us how Richard got cornered by a whole army and only survived because Diaz saved him. But then Diaz smacked him on the head for being a total idiot. Richard admits that's the only time someone's ever hit him with their full power. Then Diaz starts lecturing him in lockup, leaving the girl totally stunned. The servant says this turned Richard into a totally honest, hard-working guy who grew up to be a super handsome prince, but Richard claims he would have changed his ways regardless. Richard still feels like he owes Diaz big time, insisting they need to take out the losers before they ruin everything. So he snaps his fingers and a fat bag of cash is brought right to him. The guy grabs the bag of cash and promises they'll handle Diana. Richard demands he hand over the royal seal right now. The man insists on getting paid for his expenses first, and Richard tells, back at the village, the girls are cracking up because Diaz has a big white mustache. But then Aruna points out the twins have them too, and everyone just loses it. Back at the house, Diana was losing her mind and screaming because everyone ditched her, even though she was sure she was doing the right thing. She stared at the scepter with a smirk, knowing she was finally about to rule the whole country. Aruna is likely male, or the text has a typo. Aruna asked him not to embarrass him, implies Aruna is talking to Dia. I'll stick to the facts provided. The dog girl gets smacked right on the head, so Klaus says sorry and checks if she's all right while Canis freaks out and runs around with a first aid kit. Klaus and Canis lock eyes one more time, but they both realize it'll never work and just turn away. Diaz yells for Sidori to raise the gate, and just like that, the massive pit starts flooding with water. The dog squad was absolutely stoked that the reservoir was finally finished. Diaz was hyped they finished the water tank right before summer hit. He was also super stoked about how much extra food they were growing. Diaz was lost in thought until Bayars suddenly yanked on E. Bayanors was totally supposed to be his horse. DS was a total mess at riding, but Aruna basically forced him into the saddle. There were 3 other horses ready to go. Everyone else there was a natural with horses, except for Poors. Beers started yanking on Diaz's hair again, all because the guy actually believed horses were smart enough to understand every word he said. Diaz thought the horses' pranks were actually pretty chill, but things got way harder the moment he tried to climb onto Bayars. Bayars and Diaz head over to the twins' field, and the guy notices the girls are already fast asleep. The girls were fast asleep, dreaming about their parents. Dia looked over at the horse and flashed a smile. He decided to untie the horse so it could go snuggle up with the girls. Jallant suddenly zoomed over to Diaz to ask what was up, and the dove explained that Eldon sent a super important message and needed an answer, ASAP. The message revealed that Diana marched into the Kazdek's mansion a few days ago and demanded to see Eldon, and he had no choice but to say yes. She told Eldon she was taking care of Diaz and demanded his help, and since it was a royal order, he was basically forced to say yes. She whipped out the official orders that laid out every rule and the big goal for their team. The order didn't look official at all, but the guy still spotted that royal seal. Eldon knew that seal was only for official business and suspected this order was a total fake. But by law, that one stamp made it 100% real. Eldon read the order and told Diana he had to talk to his advisors because the conditions were making him super nervous. Eldon played the nice guy to keep the meeting going and buy some time, since he had no plans to help Diana and really just wanted to take out everyone following her. One of the advisors told Eldon he's gotta start thinking about what's coming next. Eldon refused to fight Diaz because he knew about his legendary wins and believed Diaz was the only one who could give their world a real future. Eldon wanted to shut Diana down, but he had to deal with her squad first, so the whole group ended up totally stuck without a plan. One of the advisors speaks up to ask about Diaz, insisting they need his take on things, but the leader just says he already sent a message and is waiting for a reply. Eldon calls for a timeout, and the advisor admits his daughter's letter is actually making him rethink everything. Right then, Jallant swoops into the hall, and while Eldon's hyping him up and asking for the news, the dove just stands tall and tells him to read the letter for himself. Diaz unfolded the letter, and his jaw hit the floor, making all the advisors start whispering like crazy. One advisor asked what the letter said, and the bird revealed that Diaz wanted Eldon to finally team up with Diana. Every single advisor there was totally losing their minds. Right then, Canis walked right up to Klaus and asked him what his deal was. Klaus says he's about to fight Diaz, so Diaz decides it's finally time to tell Canis how he really feels. Canis screams at the top of his lungs that he loves her. She's totally shocked but admits she loves him too, while Diaz watches the whole thing with his jaw on the floor. Canis and Klaus start talking about their future, and she tells him he's the only thing that matters to her right before he pulls her into a hug. The girls are asking what's up, but then Irina shows up and pulls them away, telling them everything is totally fine. Klaus swears he's coming back alive from the huge battle and hugs Canis tighter. She's sobbing and promises to wait for him, while a crowd of dog people line up wondering what the heck is going on. Diaz and Klaus are standing in a field at sunrise when Diaz says it's officially war, and Klaus just lowers his telescope and nods. 5 days later, it was finally time for war. Diana stood ready at the front of her army. Eldon was also there, leading the charge, and Diaz joined the fight with Ima and he. Ima tagged along with Diaz to help out, and with Diaz and Klaus leading the charge, they had a squad of 12 warriors fully geared up and packed with all the supplies they needed for the fight. Klaus realizes Diana's army is way too big and starts wishing they'd called for backup or just let Arunas help them out. Dia told Aruna that her main mission was to keep the village hidden and protect it at all costs. Klaus still really wants Eldon on his team. Diaz says he told Eldon to just follow the king's orders. He claims Eldon has been leaking secrets and sending shady letters. Diaz figured Eldon's army was a total joke, so he focused everything on keeping his people safe. But he's low-key worried Eldon saw right through him. Klaus says he totally gets. Diaz tells them they're just following the plan they all agreed on, and then he starts breaking down exactly how it's gonna work. He was totally on edge, and even though the grave dogs found the enemy's hiding spot, he still wasn't sure if their plan would actually work. If the plan totally fails, Diaz is gonna sneak behind enemy lines to take out Bayer, all by himself. But he's keeping the whole thing a secret from everyone else. He could have just rebuilt his hut and kept moving to avoid the enemies, but that would mean leaving the twins behind. He realized his support finally stopped her from crying about their parents at night, and he knew this was a massive win for both of them. He pictured the girls' faces if their home was destroyed, so he gripped his weapon tight and swore he'd protect them no matter what. Ima turns to Diaz and points straight at the bell the enemies are holding. He explains it's a war bell used to give orders during a fight. And even though it was a big deal back then, he thinks it's basically just a dusty old relic now. The bell starts blaring, Ima covers her ears, and Klaus and Diaz's eyes go wide with shock. That bell just keeps on ringing, and Diaz warns everyone that this non-stop noise is the signal for a massive army-wide attack. He tells Ima to make a run for it, the Sard. He's not watching her move. He's waiting for the actual strike and wondering what Diana is really up to. Diana and her squad geared up for the fight, while Diaz ordered all his warriors to get into their battle stances. He says he's got no clue what these guys are thinking, but he's just gonna wing it as he grips his weapon even tight. The bell rings and the fight is officially on as Diaz yells for everyone to get ready. Diana's army squared up and got ready for a fight. She had 4 whole squads out on the field at once. Everyone held their breath as they waited to see what would happen next. Diaz hoisted his axe high as Diana's warriors charged straight at him, but he just stared them down with a look that would make anyone freeze in their tracks. The fighters stopped dead in their tracks and started sizing each other up. Klaus and Diaz were totally confused why the warrior just froze, and while Diaz was still trying to figure it out, Klaus noticed Diana's guards suddenly splitting up to the left and right. DS is totally stumped by this move and wonders what kind of wild plan Diana actually cooked up. Camelot pours Eldon some tea, and the guy actually takes a second to say thanks. A knight rushes right up to them and asks what they think they're doing. Alden flashes a grin and tells everyone it's finally time for tea. The knight is completely speechless, but Eldon just shrugs and says his dad told him to never miss tea time, so that's way more important to him than anything else. The knight asks Eldon if he's seriously about to go against the king's orders. Eldon says he's just doing what he's told and reminds Diana that he's already helped her out way more than he had to. Eldon's confident the elite guards around her can handle it, reminding everyone they've only got 2 enemies to worry about. Eldon lays down his terms while chilling with his tea, and the second he finishes the cup, he demands a refill that Kamala's quickly serves up. One warrior scratched his head, thinking it was super sketchy that nobody would take this job, even though it paid a ton of cash. He never thought they'd actually take on Diaz, so he took his sweet time turning around to get out of there. His soldiers ask if he's for real, but he tells them they don't stand a chance against Diaz, especially since he's the hero who's always kept their country safe. He couldn't wrap his head around why Duke Castex's army was just standing there, so he told his men they could stay if they wanted to fight, but everyone just followed the captain's lead and cleared out. This guy sprints up to the captain to ask what's going on, but the captain just brushes him off and says goodbye, leaving the man totally confused about why they're bailing. Diaz peeks through his telescope and sees the mercenaries pulling back for some weird reason. And since Eldon is clearly just stalling, he's sure Diana's plan is a total fail. Diaz noticed only Diana's soldiers were charging at them, and after sizing them up, he figured they'd be way better off just turning around and running. Dia tells them they need to switch up the plan, and as he breaks down the new move, Cloud just flashes a huge smirk. ES tells Ima to plug her ears for a second. Then he takes a massive breath. DS lets out a massive scream, and the whole night just comes to a dead stop. Aruna heard that battle cry and knew things were finally getting good. Aruna tells the dog people they've got to have Diaz's back, and they're all totally on board. Right then, an old lady was sitting inside one of the yurts, spreading out stones all over the floor. She steps out of the yurt, and everyone on the street immediately crowds her, asking how everything went down. The old lady told them everything was totally fine, and honestly, everyone was just super happy. Eldon was watching the whole thing through his binoculars and asked his servant to check out how Klaus and Diaz were fighting. The guy said Diaz is a total beast, and Klaus is always there to back him up and cover for. The guy was totally shocked to see these little creatures jumping straight into the action. He figured they were way too clumsy to actually hold their own in a fight. Eldon realized they'd messed up. Klaus keeps on fighting, remembering the promise Canis made, right as a knight suddenly swings at him. Diaz shouts a warning just in time, and Klaus manages to dodge it. Klaus blocks the knight's strike and turns to Diaz, who points out a snake right under his feet. Klaus spots the snake, and Diaz warns him it's super deadly, saying they've almost finished off Diana's soldiers but still need to stay totally alert. Diana watched the fight go down, and she was honestly about to explode. She couldn't believe they were totally ignoring her, so she started screaming and waving her scepter around like crazy. Out of nowhere, an arrow zips by and knocks the scepter right out of her hands, so she dives off her horse to find the shooter. Aruna was busy letting her arrows fly while some dogmen right next to her started asking all about Diana. She told the dog people to grab the scepter and Diana's horse while she handled kicking that woman off the plane, giving them a quick head pat as she gave the command. Aruna charged straight ahead, planning to freak Diana out so she'd never pull a stunt like that again. Diana tried to make a break for the woods. Suddenly, an arrow slammed into the tree right in her path. She only froze for a second before she kept on sprinting. Right then, she fired off another arrow, but her hesitation made her miss the mark, and suddenly, a group of people jumped out and snatched Diana, while Aruna just stood there in total shock. The guy who snatched Diana says he totally didn't expect to run into her in the middle of the woods. They knocked the girl out cold in a flash. The leader checked his watch and started stressing that they were behind schedule. But one of the mercs snapped back, saying it was actually his fault. Suddenly, an arrow zooms right at them, So the mercenaries whip out their weapons and start hunting for whoever just attacked. The guy grabs Diana and warns her that Diaz's crew is still hunting her down. He begs the guy to stop, swearing that he and Diaz are actually buddies. He explains that Diaz's own student was the one who sent them here. Grabbing the bag, he shouts, just when he thought he was safe, an arrow slammed into his money bag and sent it crashing down. The guy says he gets the deal, so they're leaving the cash behind and taking Diana instead. Arunal just watches as those mercenaries turn tail and bolt. She grabs the bag, figuring that the guy was actually telling the truth after all. She actually pulled it off and sized up their souls. Aruna heads back to fill Diaz in on what happened with Diana, and since she knows he's probably exhausted, she decides to whip him up a meal. She started dreaming up ways to make Diaz happy, and just the thought of giving him a massage had her blushing like a total mess. She sprinted back, looking totally hyped. Diana's knight screamed that he surrendered and begged for his life, while Diaz admitted they mainly lost because their heavy gear left them totally wiped out. Klaus thrusts his spear into the air and tells everyone to scream their heads off because they just crushed the enemy. They managed to take all the enemy's gear and totally destroyed their will to. Diaz's crew is totally fine without a single scratch, and while the enemy is definitely hurting, nobody actually died. But Diaz is mostly annoyed because Diana slipped away before he could chew her out. Out of nowhere, something bites Diaz right on the head, and the attacker tells him he doesn't have to kill anyone if he doesn't want to, but even though he could have used, if Diaz just jumped in, who's even supposed to be in charge? You can't survive a war fighting like that, but Diaz claimed they had a teammate they trusted to lead. Out of nowhere, Diaz rides up on a horse and tells Eldon they're here to talk about surrendering and freeing the prisoners, so Eldon starts asking for the details. The guy asks what he means by surrender, so Eldon explains that marching an army into Diaz territory without permission is a total act of war according to the kingdom's laws. With Diana gone, the royal order is totally falling apart, so they're forced to surrender and beg Diaz for peace, but he just asks why he'd even bother talking since he's already won. Diaz calls Eldon out, saying all this talk about surrendering is just a total excuse, and Eldon just nods like he's been caught. Diaz agrees to make peace and says he's so grateful this time that they can do whatever they want without him complaining. Eldon thanked Diaz for stepping up just like Ima said, and now he's heading to see the king for what could be a massive power. Diaz was totally caught off guard when Eldon started talking about making a deal with the king, and when he asked what they'd even gain from making peace, Eldon admitted she wasn't. Eldon says the king is totally to blame this time because he let the royal seal get snatched, and now someone is using it to pump out fake official papers. They totally messed up by letting Diana escape and getting dragged into a fight they didn't want. So DS is right. He's just paying the price for the king's massive fate. Eldon is totally ready to milk this situation for everything it's worth. They started talking about payment next, and even though DS said the conversation was super awkward, he told Eldon he could use his name however he wants to get things done. Diaz tells him to just shout if he needs anything else, and Eldon gives him a quick thanks. Suddenly, Eldon and Diaz's assistant senses something weird. Then a voice tells Diaz he did an awesome job. And it's actually Aruna. She praised him for having some serious guts. Then she mixed those wild stimulant herbs from the leader into his breakfast, and it looks like they worked perfectly. Diaz asked about herbs that give you a boost, remembering the chieftain's words and realizing it was super weird that nobody was actually tired after the battle. He asked why she was using herbs to have a baby, and Aruna just said Moru told her they give off a special kind of energy. When Aruna was forced to watch over Diaz, Mora said that all their constant bickering would eventually turn into a real relationship between them. This guy is definitely going to report this mess later. Then the girl says she ran into a man while she was hunting for Diana. It turns out they were taking orders from Richard, the guy Diaz. They said Richard was going to look after the lady and even got the cash ready for Diaz, making him seem like a super nice and polite kid. But Diaz is just left wondering if he even knows a prince. He had a ton of questions for Aruna, but since they were finally finished, they decided to just head their separate ways for the day. After handing the prisoners to Eldon and scoring some sweet loot as payment, they finally started the long trek back home to Iluk village. Diaz suddenly spots the dogs, but Arunus explains they're actually the women's group from Iluk village who were sent to grab all the loot from the battlefield. Aruna and the dog-human housewives probably started this little club, and while he thought they were just hanging out, it turns out Aruna actually trained every single one of them to be. The S-ranker thought he was the one ordering Aruna to protect the village, so he complained that Aruna should have just given him a heads up first. Arunar tells him she already mentioned it, but since Diaz totally tuned her out, he gets super shocked and apologizes on the spot. Out of nowhere, Diaz spots a sorority girl with a crazy-looking staff in her mouth and calls her over to get a better look. Diaz grabs the staff, and when Aruna asks what it is, he says the gem is packed with mana and wants to pump some magic into it to see what it can do. Aruna tried to pump her magic into the staff, but absolutely nothing happened, like she was just holding a regular old rock. Diaz grabs the staff and gets this super weird feeling he can't quite place. It's like the rush of holding a battle axe. Or maybe it's just all that magic Aruna pumped into it. The guy focuses hard, the snake eyes on his staff start glowing, and suddenly a massive blast of fire explodes right out of it. Aruna thinks this power is just like his axe, while Klaus and the assistant start asking all about the fire pillar and what Diaz really did. Baruna asks Diaz if he can actually control fire, hoping they didn't do a sloppy job. Then she just snatches the staff and tells him it's hers for now. After a while, they finally head back home where Sine and Ishing link up with Diaz. Klaus reunites with his girl Canis, and the massive war between the village and Diana is officially over. They tried a bunch of different tests on the staff and Diaz's powers, only to realize that Diaz is the only person who can actually use it. Diaz just has to focus like he's fixing a battle axe to make flames appear, but since he can't explain it to the group, Aruna pumps magic into the staff so Diaz can finally let the fire rip. He says this staff is totally insane and starts fires instantly, which is way easier than using flint. So Diaz decides to use it to light up the whole village. A month later, summer is heating up and the whole capital is buzzing about the criminal Diana, who stole the royal seal to start a rebellion. But Prince Richard saw it coming and threw her in jail. Eldon is the heir to the hero of the West, Duke Kazdex, and thanks to his report, the stolen rewards for the country's savior were finally found, landing 4 of the second prince. The king was so mad that he stripped Diana of her inheritance, and while she managed to avoid being killed, she was still thrown straight into temple prison. This deal was a massive win for Richard, earning him the king's total trust and bringing in Diana's leftover followers from Mies to turn his group into the biggest powerhouse in the Cog. Eldon showed up with a ton of dirt and rare Western gifts, making the king trust him so much that he handed over a noble title and his own territory. To make up for the drama with Diana, he was actually allowed to pick out a brand new last name. The king even hooked him up with a massive deal where he doesn't have... Eventually, Richard finally steps out, and his guys are shocked he isn't in a total rage for once, since he's the only one who actually walked away a winner. The guy reveals that Richard's big win is actually a massive trap set by the Duke of Castex, and that 3-year tax break is nothing but trouble. This totally kills the massive trade profits from the West, and even worse, Duke Castex is getting way too strong by pocketing all that tax money for himself. Duke Castex told the whole crowd he's backing Richard for the throne, which basically traps Richard so he can't secretly mess with the Duke's business anymore. You can't just go and attack the people who are backing you, and there's no way they'll get the king to take back that tax break now, which has Richard totally fuming. Rumors about Diaz, the hero who saved the kingdom, were spreading everywhere, saying he was kicked out to a cursed land with 0 money, but used his holy axe to totally smash the curse. He soloed the Earth Dragon, led 100 people to build his own city, and even married a total knockout. The king is dead set on making Diaz a duke with a whole new name, and he's even hooking him up with a tax-free life. It sounded like a total lie at first, but once Eldon confirmed it from the capital, crazy rumors started blowing up all over the kingdom of Sansar. It spread like crazy across the western plains all the way to Diaz, affecting every person and place it touched. After a bit, Aruna tells Diaz that things were totally wild for a while but have finally chilled out. So Diaz says they've got to get ready for a brutal summer, and he's starting the grind first thing tomorrow. Aruna glances at the sleeping twins and tells Diaz she can help him chill out, suggesting he lie on his stomach while he thanks her. Aruna walks right up and tells him he can always count on her, promising to back him up with everything she's got, and the guy thanks her. Aruna tells Diaz to take a break so he isn't tired for tomorrow, but he just asks if she's actually serious. While Diaz and the gang were busy dealing with Diana, Francis and Francois took off west of Iluk village, and honestly, everyone was shocked because those two are usually total scaredy cats. Out of nowhere, Francis and Francois start bleeding. And even though the human dogs are talking to them, they can't understand a single word they're saying. Francis and Francois were still busy chatting and trying to call someone when a massive noise suddenly blasted out of nowhere. The dogmen were totally spooked when a voice rumbled from deep underground, basically saying it was way too early and they hadn't seen enough yet. The dogman told Francis and Francois it was time to head home, but then he asked whose voice that was. They thanked the dogman for the help and headed back to the village. And even though Asti's group thought the whole thing was super weird, they totally forgot about it once they heard. The next morning, Aruna asks Aisha if she's still totally against wearing a saddle, while Diaz suspects that Diana was actually the one who used to ride her. In the ancient language, Aisha means moon-haired horse, and that's the name of the ride Diana the Runa absolutely cherishes. They rescued her after the big battle, but since she totally hates being ridden, they just look after her instead of making her work. Arunas explains that horses get super loyal to their old owners, so instead of forcing things, she just needs to wait for it to finally trust her. Out of nowhere, Aruna's horn starts glowing green because someone just tripped her magic alarm. She'd hidden these sensors all around the village to catch intruders, but the magic only tells. Out of nowhere, someone sprints up to Diaz, shouting that something shiny and wet is heading for the village, while Diaz tries to get the dogman to chill out. The dogman said the intruder had a massive mouth, so Dia guessed it was Paijin, and Aruna totally agreed. Peking is this frog merchant who used to visit the village, and he probably asked him to spread the word about hiring while ordering the next batch. But Diaz was honestly shocked he actually found. This frog shows up talking about all the wild rumors surrounding DS, and he's actually got the gear they ordered. He introduces himself as Paijin Ray, Paijin Do's little bum. DS was totally stunned, but Aruna pointed out that the voice and clothes are actually different, so even though it looks like him, it's definitely not Page 2. The frog guy explains that the Paging Seed family is filthy rich from controlling trade on both land and water, and he's actually one of the 7 sons of the 8th boss of the Paging Octito family. Diaz asks what happened to Paijin Do, and Ray explains that Do lost something huge in a trade and got suspended, so Ray is stepping in as the rep. He brings up Ezra's first mission about finding new recruits, but the truth is, nobody in the Beastmen country actually wants to move here. That's the mess they're in right now. Diaz hates having servants, but his brother is pulling every trick in the book to help because of their family bond. Bloodless are basically beastmen who've lost all their animal traits. They look just like regular humans and aren't any stronger than us either. Nobody really knows why this happens. Fast forward a few generations, and that beast blood is totally gone. The current Beast King actually loves the people who don't have any of that blood. But the kings from back in the day, the bloodlists were treated like total garbage, and while hardly anyone wanted to leave the Beastmen land, they definitely weren't going to Sansary where everyone would just hate on them. Diaz actually married a half-human girl and welcomes every outcast with open arms, even letting them go home if they need to, so now a ton of people are ready to move to his world. He wanted to check if Diaz was cool with the bloodless before bringing them over, and it turns out Diaz was totally down to have them. DS mentions there's a lord in the next land over who's a total legend for saving half-humans and beast folk from slavery. And even though DS hasn't visited, the guy's high-end gear makes it clear he's filthy rich. The new guys can join him, but they might want to head over there instead, since he thinks anyone who's been struggling would be way better off living with the super-rich elder. Page is totally caught off guard and wishes Diaz told him sooner since this could be a massive new deal. So he asks if Diaz can set up a trade route, while Diaz realizes these brothers are basically the same person. Peking says sorry for getting way too hyped, and suggests they finally start trading, kicking things off by showing a wooden box with a fancy mother-of-pearl vessel inside. Diaz tells Pajon to knock it off since this isn't his vibe, but then Aruna slams down a fat bag of gold and says they're gonna buy up every cool piece of gear they can find. Diaz asks if he's for real since art isn't exactly a survival need, but Aruna fires back that you can't eat gold, and if they stop buying goods, the merchants will just pack up and leave. They should just let him make some money so he sees them as big-time customers who are worth coming back for. And since they've got plenty of savings, it's not like Diaz says they can just sell the leftover art to someone else and leaves the whole job in Aruna's hands. Pagan says that kind of cash can buy a ton of gear, and even though he's running low, he's got some necklaces and a super pricey gem that would look perfect on the lady. Aruna catches Paige in a lie and tells her to quit joking around, because she's got enough money to buy every single box of dried and smoked fish they have. She realizes the necklace gem is a total fake and demands the real thing, so Paige offers to toss in a whole barrel of wine to sweeten the deal. Paige is freaking out about going broke, so he tells Aruna to go back and haggle for a better deal, while Diaz just sits back knowing she's totally got this. The dogman asks the geese how they even ended up in this mess, but after one of them nips his paw, he jumps back and lets them out of the cage. These geese were straight up hunting the dogman, and she had zero clue why they were even after her. Out of nowhere, Maya shows up and asks what the heck is going on. It turns, you can just feed them leftover veggie scraps from the kitchen. These things grow incredibly fast. They're fully grown adults in only 6 months. Believe it or not, they can live anywhere. These geese are basically feathered guard dogs that scream at thieves and peck any pests away, plus you get free eggs, meat, and feathers from them. These geese are actually known as birds of grace. They're totally beefed up and have these super shiny beaks. Even their feathers and legs look like they're in peaked in. Paige starts crunching the numbers for 6 geese and offers a 20% discount, making Diaz realize they're still totally in the middle of a deal. Paige tells Aruna he's actually got some merch on hold, and when Aruna asks what it is, Paige says he heard Diaz doesn't even have an heir yet. He usually only shows this stuff to high-class nobles, but he's making a total exception for her today, and even though it's pricey, it's the real deal. He pulls out a specific outfit, and when Aruna asks about it, Paige explains it's for a spell that helps a wife get an heir right away. Aruna's totally confused how anyone could have a kid with a bunch of strings, and while Paige has no clue why, he says human nobles are obsessed with it, so Aruna just tells him to get rid of it. Pretty soon, the pile of items just kept getting bigger and bigger. Diaz felt like this crazy long bargaining war was finally coming to an end. The price actually went down, but they crammed. Diaz thought it was a tie, but Aruna and Paige knew better, and thanks to that one rating, Aruna crushed the deal while Paige sold off more than half his gear, including. He thinks they both walked away with a win, but Paige tried to sell total junk for a crazy high price, and Aruna saw right through the scam. She didn't even hold a grudge against him, but she wasn't dropping the price either, because Aruna was so good that Paige still made a massive profit just like Diaz said she would. They ended up scoring a massive haul of food, supplies, art, 6 geese, and, just like they expected, some wine from Aruna. The guys haul everything to the warehouse, and while Aruna is helping out, she finds a stash of weird outfits like dancer gear, warrior armor, waitress uniforms, and even stuff for guys. Aruna starts picturing herself in the clothes, but then realizes how weird that is with the twins around, so she switches gears and starts checking out the guys' outfits instead. Pagan's almost sold every single outfit, and he knows just one more big push will clear out the whole shop. Once they finished packing up, DS thanked everyone for the help, but then he noticed Aruna's face was bright red and asked what was up, making her totally freak out and deny everything. Paige tells Diaz they're heading out and asks what he wants for the next trade, so Diaz tells him to bring back a massive haul of stuff for dog people. They've got a stash of gold and silver coins to spend, and Paige says he's got it all figured out, telling Diaz to just trust him. Paige calls Aruna and promises to bring her something way better next time, making her blush as she tries to act like she doesn't even want it. Once PGN took off, the real grind finally started. They had to get a whole area ready just for the geese. First, they got to work building a small barn. Then they dug a path. He thinks they're fine without it, but since he heard it makes them grow way better, he's decided they should just build it anyway. The dog people rush up to Diaz to report they saved Maya's grandma and the others, and Diaz gives them a massive shout-out for the backup. Diaz saw they were all covered in dirt and asked what was going on, but Maya just told him she'd put them to work for the geese. The ladies thanked Diaz for the awesome geese, and judging by how they look, they're definitely going to have a few more birds soon. They did exactly what they had to, grabbing wood from an old barn to build the coop without even asking Diaz, because they knew it was the only way to get the job done. Diaz thanked the squad for crushing it, but then he remembered he still had to hook the dogman up with a reward for brawling with Diana. He announces that everyone's getting a victory medal, not just the warriors, but every single person who helped protect the town. So he tells the whole village of Iluk to head over to the square right now. Once everyone gathered in the square, Diaz gave a huge shout-out to the dog people for their help against Diana and announced that every single person was getting a gold coin as a reward. The warriors scored 2 coins each while the rest of the village still got a share. And since the kids' money went to their parents, everyone was hyped as Diaz and Aruna started passing out the loot. Diaz finally finished giving out the coins when the dogman suddenly called out to him, and Diaz asked him what was up. This dogman asks if he can punch a hole in the gold coin, and while Diaz is totally confused, another dogman rushes over saying he wants a hole too. He's asking why they want to punch a hole in a gold coin, and while he's not saying no, he definitely wants to hear the reason first. They asked him to poke a hole in it so they could loop a string through and wear it like a necklace, since they never wanted to let go of the reward Diaz gave them. Diaz hands them a gold coin and tells them to use it as money to buy whatever they want, but the dog people straight up refused to take it. Diaz thought it was super weird that they got paid in gold and silver coins just to use them as decorations inside the earth. Diaz thought he was finally getting a reward for all his hard work, but he was dead wrong. To them, it's a super special souvenir. Honestly, it's more like a treasure they'll keep forever. He'd normally let them do whatever they want, but if they stop using money the right way, things are going to get messy, so Diaz asked the dogman if he was actually obsessed with gold and silver. The dogman said they looked cool and shiny, but he wasn't really into them, so Diaz asked if the reward even meant anything. Dogman says it's totally worth it for the happy memories, so DS suggests giving him a reward he'll never forget, and they use actual gold. The Dogman was totally down and called it the ultimate prize, but Diaz was scratching his head because he had no clue what could be better than gold, and he needed to find 100 of them. Arunus suggests using fangs and bones from animals Diaz hunted himself, asking the Dogman if he'd be hyped to get a necklace handmade by Diaz as his reward. Everyone was totally hyped and said they'd love that. Arunus wrapped things up for the day. As soon as the necklaces were finished, Diaz would hand them out to all the dog. Diaz thanked Aruna for the sweet deal. Because of her, everyone finally got back to work. Aruna says the necklace is cool, but she wants to know if he's got Yao. Dia promises to make one for Aruna, but then he spots Senai, Aiken, and Ima, and asks if they've been at the meeting spot the whole time, while Ima explains she was just showing the twins how to practice. Scene and Ihan want in on the necklaces too, so Dia mentions those black buffalo Aruno talked about, the ones the girls love to eat, and asks if they want some jewelry made from the leftovers. Sene and Ahan turn down the necklaces, and while Diaz knows they're a pretty weak reward, he's got no choice since there's nothing else to work with. Aruna says you just have to put your heart into making something, because these human dogs don't care about money. They just want Diaz's real feelings, which makes gold coins totally worthless to them. Diaz has to carve every piece with total focus, pouring his heart into it, and even adding a tiny gem to make it look awesome. Aruna had some jewelry left to share with the guy, but Diaz was really starting to doubt if he could actually pull it off. Aruna Diaz tells him not to stress because she's a total pro, and even if he's clueless, she's going to show him the right way so he learns super fast. Diaz thanks her, but he's low-key annoyed that he's such an open book, especially since she's reading his mind before he even speaks using the same sneaky negotiation tricks page. Everyone flashes him a sweet smile, making Diaz totally blush as he realizes he finally knows exactly what they're all thinking. Diaz spends a while crafting the necklaces, and when he's finally done, he's hyped because they turned out way better than he expected. Aruna suddenly pops up to distract him, but Diaz is finally finished, so he hands her the necklace and asks her what she thinks of his work. Aruna snaps the necklace on and says it looks amazing, knowing the dog people are totally gonna love it. Diaz spent 3 whole days on just one necklace, and now he's stressing about how long it'll take to finish the rest. Arunus figured that since he'd done it once, he could totally speed things up. He didn't even need to hurry, just taking it one step at a time. Then, out. Diaz agreed to take things slow just like Aruna wanted, but then he noticed she was holding something back and asked what was up, a moment that Aruna is totally flashing back to right now. Aruna said that while Diaz was busy, they wanted to help out by building a kamadaba, which is basically a massive cooking station with a bunch of stoves, as long as the guy was down for it. They're firing up every stove in the yurt to cook, but with this many people, it's getting super cramped and a total pain to lug all their gear and food back and forth. Ima suggested they build a whole setup with ovens, a bread oven made by Klaus, a well, and even a place to wash up. She explains they're going to build a massive roof over the whole area and pack it with ovens. With a setup like that, they'll be able to whip up all kinds of food ways. DS figures they want to cook and eat right there using ovens. And while he's totally down for it, he's wondering where they'll get the supplies to build them under the roofs. Aruna thinks they can just buy a couple of roofs from Kamalos for the stables, and DS says he'll write a letter about it the next time Jalant drops by. Everything's literally burning down like it's no big deal, and Diaz just says to tell Candace she's already heading out. Kendra stayed behind in Eluk village to see if the human dogs could actually fit in, and since they're acting so chill, she's sure everything is going great. Aruna says that by the time Candace gets back, there's still a ton of work left like making Klaus's yurt bigger, but he's sure Klaus will give it his all. She tells Diaz to keep at it, but he's skeptical, asking if Candace is really coming back and why they're even talking about Klaus's yurt, which leaves her totally stunned. She's totally clueless and thinks they've been friends forever, while Candace heads back to his old village to tell his dad everything. ES is completely blown away and demands to know how long Klaus and Candace have been this close, but Aruna just can't believe he missed all those obvious vibes they were giving off during dinner. Out of nowhere, Diaz remembers that epic meal and asks if Candace is really moving in with Klaus, but Aruna says they're actually getting married once the time is right. Since they're getting so close, is a baby coming next? Aruna says Diaz is going to grill them for all the juicy details. Diaz was feeling hyped for the two of them, but suddenly everyone started shouting about how lucky Aruna was to snag the very first finished item. Aruna said she was totally obsessed with the product, But right then, Klaus started screaming in his ear like it was a total disaster, just because he couldn't figure out the perfect engagement present. A bit later, DS is chilling in his yard making necklaces, and he's actually a total pro since, like Aruna said, focusing on one at a time really helped him master the craft. Suddenly, he spots Sini and Hen watching him from a distance and realizes they want necklaces too. So he tells them not to worry because he's making some for them as well. The girls threw the door open and bolted, while Diaz screamed at them to shut it behind them. Diaz was just closing the door when Klaus suddenly barged in, asking for a second to talk and telling the kid to just chill out and explain what was going on. After a bit, Diaz asks Klaus if he's seriously stuck on what engagement gift to give Canis's parents. Cloud agrees, but even though Canis said they're fine, he still thinks they need to get way more ready. Klaus asks if Diaz seriously gave Aaron's parents an engagement gift too, and he's dying to know what the guy actually got for the girl. Diaz admits he was backed into a corner and forced to marry, so he handed over the Earth Dragon loot, making Klaus freak out and ask what Aaron's parents thought about it. Diaz was super hyped, and since Mo-Ru said there were only about 30 black buffaloes or bulls to deal with, he knew he could totally handle that. DS says their whole culture is the problem because they're worried giving up the black buffalo will ruin their happiness, even though the guy already paid them in gold coins. She asks if they should just use the money to buy a cool gift. But Klaus admits he doesn't feel like he earned any of it and is just happy he's famous now. He's all about giving things he earned with his own hard work. And after hearing Diaz's story, he's so hyped to be like him and Runa that he wants to share. Diaz knew hunting an Earth Dragon was a total suicide mission, and he had no idea if they'd even be satisfied with just some black buffalo meat. Diaz suddenly remembers how super soft and fluffy those sheep are. First, he's got to go hunt down some black buffalo. Then he has to take that buffalo to one village and trade. Klaus is hooking May up with some high-quality fabric as an engagement gift, and since that stuff is super useful, he's sure it's going to be a total hit. Kamalos is seriously blown away by how high-quality the Mia fabric is. He's totally sure the girl's parents are going to be hyped about it. Klaus agrees, pointing out that it'd be awesome to learn the secrets of hunting them, but Diaz thinks his advice won't help at all. Klaus agrees, calling their style totally brutal, but he's ready to learn their moves and gives Diaz a huge thanks. 5 days later, Diaz was still grinding away at the jewelry, but he said now that he's got the hang of it, things are moving way faster and he'll be totally finished in just a few more days. Aruna suddenly cuts him off to say Kana is back, and even though she apologizes for barging in, he's actually hyped to hear the report. She's finally back and her parents actually gave her the green light. So starting today, she's officially moving in as part of the family and promised to give it her all while asking him to look out for her. Diaz tells her she's got to look out for them too, and even though she's had a rough time, he wants her to give it a shot. And she's totally in. Aruna asks about the report, and the girl suddenly remembers she has it, explaining that Eldon and Kamalos are missing because they're off at the royal capital. Her dad is running the show as the deputy lord now, and right as she announces her wedding, she also demands they build a whole new place filled with ovens. The supplies and workers are coming later, so her dad is stuck there and only her mom can actually make it to the wedding. She's heading off with Klaus to meet the guests, so her dad can throw a huge banquet. And since she'll be staying for a few days, she asks DS to look after her. The ceremony was totally on hold until the Black Buffalo hut was finished, but then Diaz realized they were forgetting something huge. The guy asks when they're heading out, and she says she's leaving right this second, which totally shocks Diaz and Aruna, but then she asks if Klaus is also about to take off. Klaus hunts black buffalo every single day, but he's only managed to bag 2 in the last 5 days, so things are looking pretty rough for him. That Matabi powder should have made the hunt a total breeze, but Klaus decided to use his own squad instead, and that's exactly why they're in this massive mess. Even though the girls and his master offered to help, Klaus refused to budge, insisting he had to handle the engagement gift all by himself no matter what. He didn't even use the tabby powder. With no human dogs to help, he's out there sprinting across the massive plains all by himself. He actually caught 2 buffaloes without leaving a... She's super curious about what Klaus is up to, and while she loves the gift, the real win is the massive influence he just gave her. Now she can finally ask for backup without hiding, so Diaz asks Kainis what her next move is. Kana says she'll definitely slap some sense into her husband whenever he acts like an idiot, but she's low-key hurting because Klaus doesn't realize how much it would crush her. Her mom always said this was the best way to handle people like that, and her dad had to deal with it a ton of times too. Kana heads out, but then Aruna starts waving like crazy, so DS asks her what the heck she's doing. Aruna says she just wants to step up as a wife if things go south. But Diaz tells her to chill out, so she asks if he's really not going to stop her. Diaz straight up said if he does something to earn a slap from Aruna, he totally deserves it and will just have to take it. Arunas flashed a grin and asked Diaz if he'd picked out a gift for Klaus and Canis. Yet, while the girls were busy setting up the massive feast, and Diaz promised he'd definitely have something cool ready for the ceremony, he still hadn't figured out what gift to give. Out of nowhere, Arunas started practicing his moves. Diaz was determined to find a way to celebrate no matter what. And man, those strikes. Once Klaus got what he needed from Canis, he finally stopped being so stubborn, teamed up with the dog people to use the matapi powder, and even started going on hunts with Canis. He totally crushed it and got exactly what he wanted. In only 3 days, he'd already rounded up all those black buffalo. Right after that, Klaus and the crew headed straight for the hut. Diaz waved them off while low-key panicking inside because he'd been so busy making necklaces that he didn't have a gift ready, never thinking they'd finish that buffalo. Aruna and the crew are going to have a massive feast when they get back, but time is seriously running out. And even though Diaz knows he should talk to Aruna, he already told her everything. Dia admitted he had no one else to turn to, so he just decided to spill everything, telling her all about the field, his secret deals with the pagans, and that massive fight with Diana. He showed up with some loot from back then and told them to use it however they wanted, making the chief admit he's always way ahead of the game. So she decides to drop some. DS can whip up a wedding gift super fast, and she's thinking some top-tier Mia Bedlanon since they always have a ton of extra stock to give away right now. She says it's the perfect gift for newlyweds, which makes Diaz immediately think about them spending the night together, and he agrees it's a good fit since Klaus still acts like such a kid. The chief complained that she'd never get to see a grandbaby at this rate since the couple was being way too shy, so she decided to step in and give them a little something. She's giving him a special charm stitched with prayers for health and a safe birth, telling him to keep it on him, and Diaz makes sure to thank the elder. DS notices the pillow has totally different patterns on each side, so the chief just lets the guy keep it. Diaz spots the bag and asks what's inside, so the chief explains it's actually medicine for a baby about to be born. A few days later, workers and supplies showed up from the nearby towns, and it only took them 3 days to finish the oven room and the roof. Plus, they even hooked them up with a goose barn and a bathroom. DS hooked everyone up with 10 gold coins to say thanks, covered the cost of the materials, and even though he was sweating about the price, it turns out everything was totally fine. The next day, the craftsmen head back to the nearby land, and Klaus rolls in with a cart totally packed with souvenirs. The cart pulled over by a forest for a quick snack break, and the man thanked the guy for letting a total stranger hitch a ride and even making him some tea. The guy said their foster dad raised them right, and since they were all headed to the same spot, they weren't about to let the old man travel all alone. She said she needed to see their dad right now, but that's when Klaus suddenly popped into her head. A bit later, Diaz asks Aruna how he looks since he feels totally ridiculous, but she tells him he looks awesome and asks him to lean down for a second. Then she reaches over and smooths out his hair. It's finally time for Klaus and Canis to tie the knot, and they've got a host ready for a ceremony that mixes the kingdom's rules with the dog people's traditions that Klaus asked for. Canis was obsessed with the Oni tribe's secret traditions, a special celebration only found in Iluk village where his mom, Martel, actually showed up for the wedding. Diaz starts his speech by saying that nobody can survive this world all by themselves. That's why we find someone to love and turn them into our own family. Today, everyone is here to celebrate these. For anyone looking to start a family, the wedding is a huge deal because you have to write out the Holy D's blessing perfectly, and they've had these sacred words drilled into their. He still knows every single word by heart without making a single mistake. Back on the battlefield, he'd say the funeral prayers whenever his friends died. He'd chant about the beauty of. Klaus remembered that day and begged him to lead the ceremony, so he's stepping up to do it since Saint DDA's rules are actually pretty easy to follow. Just love yourself and everyone around you. Enjoy the ride, and whatever you do, don't hurt people, steal their gear, or mess with their turf. And definitely don't look down on anyone for where they're from or how they live. It's honestly crazy how people forget the basics. But Saint Dio was always right there by the Founder King's side, using that insane wisdom he brought back from the Holy Land to help. Once the kingdom was finally chill and everyone was safe, he built a huge temple to honor God, slept on the holy ground, and left behind all these legendary lessons, but he never actually got married or had kids before he died. Everyone's here today to eat, party, and dance like crazy to celebrate the couple's big new start together. The food is finally ready, so they all dig into the feast and the party officially kicks off. Diaz decides to grab a bite too, noticing the bread is totally packed with walnuts. And once he realizes Shini and Ihan actually made it, He tells them it tastes incredible. The girls start getting loud, but once Diaz calls them out for being rude, Sine and Ihan chill out immediately. Someone gives Chef Marf and Sadori the signal to go, and suddenly the dog people start hurling clouds everywhere. The dog people have this feast ritual where they carry a happy groom through the village to show him off and let everyone know he's officially off the market. They do this to stop anyone from backstabbing the group. And even though it feels totally pointless with everyone here, a ritual is still a ritual. Then the dog people start closing in, beating him up in a weird ritual because they're super jealous of the groom's happy marriage and want everyone to know how lonely they really are. Klaus was absolutely cracking up at this point. Everyone was having a total blast together. Klaus thanked the whole crew for celebrating the start of his brand new life. He promised that he and Orshama. Candace screamed that she'd give it everything she had, promising they'd finally be happy together with Klaus. The wedding was a total vibe, with everyone laughing, dancing, and stuffing their faces with some seriously good food. Out of nowhere, Aruna asks Diaz to dance. And when he admits he's got zero rhythm, she basically tells him she didn't expect much from him anyway. Their tribe doesn't really do stuff like this, but since Maya taught her some moves earlier, she takes the chance and starts dancing for the guy. Diaz and Arunas finally hit the dance floor, and even though Diaz is super nervous, he looks around at the crowd and realizes Arunas is leaning right against him. A little while later, after all the eating and dancing, the whole party got super chill, catching that awesome, unique vibe you only get at the end of a big celebration. It's finally time. Diaz brings out the chest and tells the dogman to gather everyone up so he can hand out necklaces as a reward for the battle. The dog people all swarmed Diaz, but he told them to chill out since there was plenty for everyone to stand up and get their share one by one. He wanted to give them out the second they were finished, but everyone was way too busy to stop. Klaus and the gang suggested waiting for the big feast instead. Finally, he hands out the keys. Candace is totally stunned and asks if the jewelry is really for her, so Diaz tells her to just take it as a gift to show she's officially part of the village now. Sine and Akin walk up to Candace and hand her some cool embroidered handkerchiefs as a gift. She thanks the twins, and then the dog people give her some awesome stones they found on the yacht. Francis and Francois handed over a piece of the Mia family treasure. Emma shared a poem for their happiness, and right as Klaus thanked everyone, he spotted some super weird rock salt. IS wonders if they've ever dug up anything like this around here, and Diaz suddenly realizes he needs a gift too. Diaz calls over Klaus and Canis to give them a gift, and Klaus is totally blown away as he thanks him for the bedlin. Aruna was super hyped that Diaz knew all about the special bed sheets for having kids and safe births, and even Maya had to give him props for. Aruna tells Diaz to get bedlin onto the yurt, and right as he agrees, he sees the whole crowd gathering to say they should just leave the rest to the two kids. Diaz didn't think talking about bed sheets meant they had to rush before the sun went down, so the party ended way earlier than anyone expected. Diaz was supposed to be the host today, but Aruna told him he had to help everyone else out too, and he actually went along with it. Meanwhile, the guys in bearskins were hiding out in a cave when one of them realized he'd finally found the trail leading straight to the village. Word on the street is some rich guy's been buying tons of stuff from the beast people in their secret village on the Nutris Plain, and someone just saw a carriage heading straight there. If she's making a break for the village, they can just follow her tracks. And if that doesn't work, they'll just jump the carriage because the strong always get to boss. This guy Hugus claims he's going to rule over everyone, and now a total nightmare of an enemy is heading straight for the village. As their carriage rolls across the empty plains, the guy asks if she's sure they're in the right spot since it's literally just grass everywhere. But she's positive they've made it because they're just west of Kazdex's territory. Out of nowhere, a dog man jumps in front of them and demands to know who they are, warning that if they're bandits, she's going to bite them, and they better get lost fast. Diaz was just chilling inside his yurt. Summer had finally arrived. His life was starting to look a little different lately. Since Francois is having a baby in the fall, she spends pretty much all day. She isn't actually sick, she's just in a phase where she's super restless. So Francis keeps bolting out to the meadow all day long to find the perfect soft grass. He chewed the food to soften it up, fed it to Francois, and then bolted right back to the meadow. Aruna says this isn't normal for his kind, so Francis must really care about. After finishing his training and work, he started staying by her side every night since the baby was almost here. But then someone suddenly called out for Diaz. The dogman crashed into the yurt and told Diaz that some bandit-looking thugs just rolled up with a ton of ma. She said there were only 6 of her and they seemed super friendly. So Aruna told Diaz they had to bounce because Francois said their guests were waiting. She totally agrees that anyone hanging with Mia is safe. And since they brought 6 Mias at once, the Lord really needs to come see them in person. They reach the plane and Diaz spots backup arriving. So he screams for AESA and Array, while Aruna asks if he actually knows these guys. I ran up to Diaz and called him both father and brother, leaving Aruna totally stunned when she heard the girl call him dad. Diaz pointed out how much they'd both grown and was just glad they were safe. Then he asked about the rest of the squad, and Eerie told him everyone was doing great, running shops and even getting married. Out of nowhere, a guy disguised as a woman bolts out of the cart. Diaz is hyped to see Eric and tells everyone he's officially on their side. Diaz mentions how healthy he looks, which Diaz asked Eric if he was all right, but Eric just told him to call Eerie while Mia rushed to his side, and even though he collapsed, he said he was fine and thanked the feet. Diaz realized Francois was totally right about these 3 being super sweet kids, even if Eric looked a little creepy. Diaz suddenly spots Ben in another wagon and realizes he's actually alive. And even though Diaz thought he was a goner, Ben tells him to stop trying to kill him, joking that even though Aruna walks up to Diaz and says his uncle is worried about the guy, but then he drops the big question. Why did that girl just call him dad? Aruna starts panicking and grills him about his kid, asking how he even has a son this big and who the mystery mom is. Isu asks who the kid is, but Aruna points at Diaz and screams that she's actually his wife, leaving Isu totally shocked since the girl looks way too young for that. Arunus explains she's from the Oni tribe and doesn't know the kingdom's laws, so Isu apologized for being rude and asked her not to be mad. Aruna apologized for her super awkward mistake, while Diaz stepped in to explain who these kids actually were. Out of nowhere, Aruna's horn starts glowing like crazy, and as the girl whips around to look into the distance, a whole squad of invaders suddenly shows up. Yuga introduces himself and tells Diaz he's super disappointed that they're hoarding all that money, because their greed is forcing everyone to jump right back into the fight. They've killed each other way too many times, so he's finally making a deal and ordering Diaz and the crew to bow down. Because the strong rule the weak, and they have to fall in line. The runner acts like she has no clue what he's saying and suddenly drops a mist spell, leaving Hughes totally shocked as they vanish right before his eyes. Ishu was totally shocked and asked if they were seriously invisible. So Aruna explained she used a camouflage spell and they needed to run while they still could, even though Isu still couldn't. Ayesu admitted they had no clue someone was stalking them, but she did hear some tea about Hugu's past. He used to be a legendary knight for the kingdom, but after his own. Plus, this guy's got some seriously twisted beliefs, so Aruna walks up to Diaz and tells him he's got a plan. Hugues' assistant said they were nowhere to be found and it was time to leave, but Hugues just laughed at how pathetic they were, telling them they'd be safe as long as, out of nowhere, Diaz calls out Hugo, claiming he's the lord of this land and demanding a 1v1 duel. While Puyugus is totally shocked to see the legendary hero who, Aruna stayed right by Diaz's side, hyping him up and telling him to repeat every single word she said. Diaz lays down the law. If Hugo wins, Diaz will follow him. But if Hugo loses, he's working for Diaz. So they're going to settle who's the real boss right now. Hugh's assistant warns him it's a total trap, but Diaz just smirks and asks if he's too scared to drop his sword and fight. So Hugh tosses the blade aside and says it's time to see who's actually strong. Aruna was sure Hughes was finally cornered. Even for a bad guy, he actually told the truth. You could almost say he was honest in a weird way. Or maybe he was just... Hugues steps up to Diaz and tells him to bring it on, sparking a massive fight where he demands to know how a lord from such a far-off place got this insanely powerful. Diaz shuts Hugo down, telling him that nobody can survive on their own, not even the toughest guys, because it's your friends and family that keep you going, and real strength is all about protecting and taking care of your people. Diaz tells Hugo he better start grinding, then blasts him with a punch that sends him flying until his crew catches him and begs him to leave since they aren't even on this guy's level. Aruna agreed, saying she knew her husband would come through just like she expected. The girls all grinned as Aruna's reminded them they're basically Diaz's family, so they had to stick together to back him up, and Isue was totally down with that. Aruna asks where their mom is so she can say hi, but the girl reveals they're actually orphans who call their caretaker dad instead of teacher because they love him so much. Aruna says she gets it, but Isu wonders if meeting up was a huge mistake since Papa lost, though Arunus is confident she would have just handled anyone who tried to step up. When it comes to raw strength, Diaz is basically unbeatable. Araya said that for the longest time, Everyone absolutely loved and respected his brother. He was just an orphan who worked his tail. Diaz teamed up all these orphans to look out for one another like a real squad, and their leader lived right in the trash with them while teaching everyone how to read, write, and work hard to make something of themselves. Arunasad was shocked that Diaz could actually read and write, and Aisu explained that thanks to her brother, the orphans stopped their wild pranks, and the whole town finally started to trust them. They finally started getting better jobs and actually turned their lives around. This is the Diaz they all look up to. He's more than just a leader. He's like a brother. The guy standing right next to him is Ben. He's Diaz's big brother and used to be a super strict temple minister. He taught Diaz everything he knew when they were kids. Ayan and Sini asked if Diaz's parents were just like him, but he told them they were actually the total opposite. Super chill and kind. They were basically just doing chores at the temple, and Ben told them it was their fault for not explaining things to the kid, especially since Diaz's parents were the top 2 high priests out of. These guys were actually high priests from the legendary Great Temple in the East. Nobody could believe they held such a high rank at a place like that. Aruna turned to DS and asked what. Asa said the full story is way too long, so let's skip to the part where Saint Dea and the founding king went to the Holy Land, met the gods, and walked away with a massive source of knowledge. He also got some holy relics that the first king used to build the whole kingdom and bring peace, while Saint Aya decided to skip serving the king and built a temple instead. This temple is the main spot for spreading the word about their spiritual father. Right after Saint Dea passed away, temples like this started popping up all over the kingdom. The priests, Saint Dea's teachings have zero info on what God even looks like, and a ton of her other lessons are so confusing that nobody knows what they're actually about. Ben says they built these massive temples in the capital and in every direction, north, south, east, and west, and they've got the power to match their giant size. This idiot's parents, brother, and wife were all high priests at the Great Temple of the East, and Irai straight up asked if that place was just a hideout for those villains. Ben totally gets why Irai feels that way since priests have become total jokes lately, and Diaz even remembers his uncle talking about a massive secret war that went down in the temple way before he was born. Uncle Ben decided to end the beef by heading straight to the Holy Land to learn from God, leaving Diaz's parents in charge while he started his big journey. He headed back to the kingdom only to find his wife and family were gone, and even his old school had completely vanished. The temple was now run by a new group that had turned the whole place. He just wanted to find his brother's family, so he did some digging and finally tracked Diaz down. The high priest's only son was actually out there on the battlefield. He asks Diaz if he has any clue how it felt to be called a heartless killer, so now he's determined to smash that idiot's head in no matter what. Seeing that Diaz has a great fiancé and is actually doing okay for himself, Ben decides to let it go, especially since he realized all those sheep, bats, and puppies he saw on the way are. So these two idiots were actually hyped to go back to Earth. And even though he knows Aruna has her hands full with such a clueless husband, he begs her to keep looking after him since. Aruna shakes Ben's hand and says she's stoked to finally meet her uncle. But Ben tells her to drop the formal talk and just call him something way more chill. Eric suddenly turns on Aruna, asking how she dares to act like his fiancé when they've actually been married for 20 whole years. Diaz is totally confused, but Eric tells him to use the name Eerie and brings up that old promise to buy her a ring when she grows up, making Diaz realize this is all about her birthday. He remembers promising to buy Eerie that ring once he grew up and actually had some cash, and now she's asking if he's basically proposing to her. Ben looks Diaz in the eye and tells him he's a guy, admitting he thought he was a total weirdo when they first met, but Diaz just says he used to be away. Aruna says this kid's soul is shaped like a girl's, so he might actually have a female heart. Aisui tells Diaz that Sini and Ai-Hen are the new little sisters, and even though his fiancé is a total cutie, these kids are just as adorable. But then Eric ruins the. Back in the village, Hugis and his crew are grinding in the fields, and he warns them to work hard since these are direct orders from the big man, Diaz.